ASB, I think we have legal definitions which all practitioners are aware of. It's just been amended by the latest legislation in 2014. But I think what's important is what is antisocial to members of the public, to the local communities that we serve. And I think that changes depending on the community, where it's located, the tolerance levels that that community has. I think what's really more important for me is the types of antisocial behaviour that London suffers, and who has responsibility for dealing with it. And I think when we start looking at definitions of antisocial behaviour, it sometimes gives people an opportunity to back out of responsibility, because it sounds too much like that's what the police should be dealing with, that's what housing should be dealing with. And the one thing I've found with antisocial behaviour is you cannot deal with it in isolation. It has to be done through partnership, working and problem solving. And I think that when you actually do get it right, other things benefit from it as well, and not just antisocial behaviour. It empowers communities to take responsibility for themselves.
Okay, thank you, Paul. The Met's definition at a higher level is personal, nuisance and environmental. So personal when it's directly affecting you.
Absolutely.
Nuisance when it's affecting a group.
Yeah.
Perhaps noise, and then the environmental is placemaking. But anyway, Janine, what's your thoughts around that?
Again, thank you very much for having us here today. I agree with Paul in the main part. I think practitioners always struggle with the definition of ASB that we find in the legislation, because it's subjective. So actually it's about how it makes people feel. It's not a nice, neat criminal action which clearly sets out, if I commit theft, I go into a shop and I steal something. It doesn't matter what my mindset was. It doesn't matter what the impact on the people suffering was. But actually with ASB, it is very subjective. It's about how it makes someone feel. Now, the positives of that is it's very wide-reaching. And actually, we see some really good uses of ASB legislation for some quite serious behaviour. So even dealing with serious organised crime groups where perhaps there isn't enough evidence to take criminal action, some of the ASB tools are used and quite effectively. But of course, if you've got inexperienced practitioners, very broad-reaching definitions actually scare people and put people off. And I picked up the point that Paul made, that it can sometimes be easy, whether intentionally or not, to actually not take action in cases where you can do, because you struggle with the definition, what it actually means in reality.
David, your board members, do they correspond to those sort of thoughts?
Well, Steve, could I just first say that whilst I'm down as chair of Hammersmith and Fulham Safer Neighbourhood Board, I'm actually also today here representing the London Communities Policing Partnership, LCP2. I sit on their board, and LCP2 today, if you like, represents the majority of the safer neighbourhood boards across London. And as such, I think is probably the only community-based pan-London organisation that you as a committee could talk to with one voice.
We are going. I know the group well, and we are aiming to have a meeting just with the board and members later. Just to give you comfort, David, on that.
No, indeed so. And in fact, it was on that basis that I was partially here today. I will wear a Hammersmith and Fulham cap when we come on to other questions. But in that respect, that's where I'm representing today. In terms of the definitions, I won't. I agree with the two people to my right. It's a tough call. One person's antisocial behaviour is another person's minor annoyance. There's a huge spectrum out there. And I guess, just putting in a point here at the moment, I think one has to be careful here, because there is a case of wood for trees. We could get covered in an avalanche of ASB from one end of the spectrum to the other. And I think part of this morning's process will be interesting to see how we kind of unpick that in a way and take it forward.
Okay, thank you. Molly.
Hi. For me, I think I agree as well with everything that was said. There are two key points around definitions, though. One is around statistics, and I know we'll come to that, but without clear definitions that are understood across the range of organisations, it's really hard to actually understand what's really going on in terms of ASB in each of those areas, and therefore which they are. The other problem which links to that is that without a kind of standard definition or an understanding of what ASB is, at least to some degree between different practitioners, say local authority, police, environmental health, etc., and public, people get lost slip between the gaps where for one it is and for one it isn't, and people can get shuffled around. So I think for me, in terms of definition, is not so much how do we define it, but it's how do we define it together as a group.
Okay, Joe?
It's difficult for me to really contravene anything that's actually said there, but what I will say, at Peabody we find there's a different tolerance level depending on where people live. We have estates and then we have street properties. you normally find that on the estates we have a lower tolerance level because of the density of the housing that's actually there. But we actually split it into two, so it's going back to the wood for the trees, we actually have low level that's dealt with by our neighbourhood managers, and then high level that's dealt with by a specialist team. The highest cases that we have, 32% of my cases are noise. Right. And it's all because of the type of properties that people are actually living in. And currently we're doing a pilot where a lot of that noise will not be treated as ASB anymore. It will be dealt with by another team, so we're not ignoring it, but it will no longer be classed as antisocial behaviour. It's a 6-month pilot, started from May, so we're yet to get the full results on that. But we can already see it's decreasing the numbers of what we actually class as antisocial behaviour.
So you'll be concentrating on noise in and of itself as a main issue for your residents?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
That's really interesting. Roger, do you want to add to anything that we've heard?
A few things. So one of the things that I'm a barrister, I specialise in social housing, and one of the things that I did a couple of years ago was write Cornerstone on antisocial behaviour, which is the leading textbook on the new powers. And I had to look at the definition, the legal definition of antisocial behaviour. A part of that was looking at historically what matters have been considered by the courts to be antisocial behaviour. So it is important to have a definition from the point of view of enforcement. But I think there are two things that flow out of that have come out of what the other speakers have said, and that is that sometimes those definitions can be used to avoid responsibility. And local authorities saying, well, that's not our remit, that's another body's remit. The police saying, well, that's not our remit, that's the local authority's remit. And things get passed between the various bodies that ought to be responsible. The other thing that comes out of a definition and having too rigid a definition is that sometimes we forget about the impact. And picking up on some of the terminology that Joe used, a lot of practitioners use the reference to low level and high level. But actually, it seems to me that what's more important is low impact and high impact, because it's about the individual and their perception of the impact on them. And if one looks at cases like Pilkington and the IPCC's report into what happened there were some very serious incidents of antisocial behaviour. And we know that there were tragic consequences in that case. But in the main, what was going on was a form of fairly low-level impact, low-level bullying, which was having a high impact on the vulnerable individuals. And so there are some dangers in having too rigid a definition of antisocial behaviour, but equally one needs it in order to take action. So I think the committee needs to be mindful of ensuring that it's as inclusive as possible, because what's antisocial behaviour to one person may not be to another. Yeah,
I mean, absolutely right, Kuljit. I mean, it's that perception in the eye of the beholder, what is antisocial behaviour and what is the severity. So you said what people sometimes kind of lazily use the term low level, when it's a case of personal antisocial behaviour aimed at one person, that low level can have a disproportionate effect on that person at the receiving end of it, even though it's deemed categorised by some others, perhaps the receiving call of please, as kind of low level. So
but the categorisation, sorry to cut across you, it's quite important, because categorising then determines what happens to that behaviour and whether there's any enforcement action taken. And either it's in the category where there's no resources allocated to that behaviour, or something gets done. And so it is important at that very early, almost triage stage, that things are categorised in an appropriate fashion.
Do you want to come on this point, Peter?
Yes, just it's interesting this this objective and subjective definition and what have you. I mean, for example, I'm just throwing something out there. Would littering, public littering, be considered antisocial behaviour, do you think, by everybody?
It is by us, but I would go back to the point, because I raised the high level and low level. And the low level doesn't mean that nobody's going to be dealing with it. It just means that it's dealt with by another team, not my ASB team. So if it was littering, for instance, I would be talking to my head of estate services, who would get his team to actually deal with that. So we're talking about fly tipping, we're talking about disposal of bulk rubbish, as well as littering, is all dealt with by that specific team, but not by my antisocial behaviour team.
I think that perfectly demonstrates the complexities of these issues, though, because if I was to suffer one incident of seeing some litter on the floor, then yes, I could say it was ASB, but actually, have I got any expectations really that someone might do something about that? However, if I'm walking outside my door because someone is purposely dumping their bin in front of my door to cause me intimidation and fear, then actually that's a far bigger issue, because that verges on harassment. And I think what Kuljit's saying is the danger of saying that litter is always a low-level issue moves you away from the idea of actually really assessing how often it's happening, what the vulnerabilities of the victim are, what the intention is of that littering offence.
I would add one point here, which is I think that ASB can often be dealt with by looking at an event and looking at perpetrators, and when you have this kind of strong enforcement view, you look at, you know, maybe what have they been doing, and actually it's where it's so important to bring in the victim's needs, because in Victims Court we do assessment on people that are coming in for antisocial behaviour issues, and you'll find that people are reporting very high levels of prevalence. If something might be happening on a daily basis, they might have an extremely high impact to their mental health, to other aspects of their livelihood or their kind of day-to-day life. But if people aren't asking them what's going on and talking to the victims, you don't have this way of gauging it. So you have to always involve the two sides to get that picture of impact. Otherwise it becomes just the high or low level.
So we'll have some question later about people's experiences and the direct effect. That's really helpful on that. Andrew, do you want
I'm just going to go on Joe's point about noise, and you've explained what you do, but why is the question that I'd ask. Why is noise not considered antisocial behaviour if that's one of the main forms of complaint, and the impact it can have on people, particularly prolonged noise late at night from loud amplified music, for example, is really
right. So that would be different. That type of noise, where it would be regular loud parties and stuff, we would be treating that as antisocial behaviour. But most of the cases that we actually have is normal domestic living, and so when you have high density people, especially with shift work and the way that the world works nowadays, people's lives aren't just strictly 9 to 5 anymore, so you get families interacting in a different way. What we've also found now is that there's a lot of families who won't let their children go outside anymore to play, so the kids are now playing inside the properties and not outside the properties. And one of the worst things for me is fashion now to not have carpets. People put laminated floorings down, and if they don't put in the correct insulation, you can hear almost everything that goes on them. My staff spend so much time trying to persuade people to pull up their laminated floorings or put rugs down, and we can't enforce that on a tenancy agreement. We have to use persuasion in order for that to happen.
Can I just give you a real-life example on that? Sorry, forgive me. So I did a case a few years back where we had a sound expert come in to look at sound transfer between 2 floors of a converted house. And in fact, a number of the properties on that street have been converted. They were owned by the local authority. And the expert's evidence was that the dropping of a paperback book on the floor above caused intrusive noise on the floor below, which is quite something when you think about the fact that that's not a very heavy item that's being dropped. But that's the sort of thing we're dealing with. And partly it's to do with construction of buildings, partly it's to do with conversion, partly it's to do with the simple density of people within some buildings.
Yeah.
So when you talk about noise, the noise that I think we would consider antisocial behaviour, like the loud late night parties, is still ASB.
That would be classed as antisocial behaviour.
Whereas noise, which is normal day-to-day life, isn't.
But at the moment, I said we're doing the pilot at the moment. So until that pilot is actually concluded and we get the results, we won't know exactly how we're going to be treating it from now on. But until the pilot started, we had been treating that as antisocial behaviour until the pilot started.
So that's presumably going to impact on your figures as well?
It will do, but it's not to say that we're ignoring it. It just means it's not dealt with by my specialist antisocial behaviour team. It will be dealt with as normal housing management, and that's what they'll have to deal with. Yeah. But we've actually got noise machines that we put in people's homes. One of the things, though, that I have found, as soon as we put a noise machine inside someone's home to record the noise, the expectation of the person's is that this is going to pick it up and I'll definitely be able to get something done. 9 times out of 10, when we get it back and we look at the recordings, there's no statutory nuisance. And all we can do is get mediation in between the 2 households to try and resolve the matter.
I think when you talked about the work you're doing, I heard that actually you were treating it even more in a cleverer way, which hopefully will be the benefit of your residents.
That's what we're hoping.
That's the kind of hope. It's useful, just as an aside, hearing about noise as something that you see probably in your world as possibly the worst, or the top level anti-social. As this debate sort of progresses, it'd be interesting, not perhaps this minute, for you to give us an idea of what is the number one in your particular field ASB issue. Now, my next question is talking about data. I touched upon earlier, much of our reliance is on Met data, largely the calls to the Met Centre, when they will log, they ask the question and then try to do some classification around it. The trends on the figures over a period of years has apparently gone down. However, we have seen a spike and an increase over the last year. and notwithstanding those figures, antisocial behaviour continues to be a priority. But we appear to be heavily reliant on those met figures. So really I wanted to talk to you about the gaps in the data, because until we have the proper data, we can't really get underneath the issue. So what sort of gaps have we got? And what sort of other data do you use as professionals that you can help us with at all? Anybody wish to? I saw Paul signal first, David.
Quickly, I've just been working in one London borough, and they use the 101 non-emergency number for all antisocial behaviour calls.
Yeah.
And that's as a result of noise, environmental issues, all the things you mentioned. It doesn't work. It shows an unclear picture. It throws responsibility off certain organisations to record what complaints they're getting, because they're putting the responsibility and emphasis on one organisation. If I've got a problem with noise, or I've got a problem with environmental issues, the last person I want to phone is a police officer. I want to speak to somebody in the council who's going to be able to deal with it. And I think what has happened as a result of that, you're having an unclear picture of antisocial behaviour across London, because one, people feel guilty phoning the police about an antisocial behaviour issue when they're seeing on a nightly basis the police rushing around London dealing with major incidents. Secondly, some people don't want to speak to the police in relation to their ASB because they're worried of the consequences of it. They're worried how the police are going to deal with it. And secondly, I think, as I said, that the police can't deal with it, and their only response in relation to that antisocial behaviour call is that we'll get an officer to come round and deal with it, which just doesn't work. And I'll give you a quick example. On this particular borough I was dealing with, there was a lady phoned at 101 because she was told it was the antisocial behaviour line, because she saw two drug dealers fighting. One stabbed the other one, so she phoned 101 because she was told that was where you phone ASB, which is drug dealing in that particular borough. 20 minutes later, she finally got through to the emergency services, who told her off for not phoning 999. And I think the public are completely and utterly confused who deals with ASB, who they should be contacting in relation to what types of ASB. And I think, as I said, because people are not keeping that data anymore, they're making it more difficult for the public to get through to the right people.
Have you any other recommendations on where we can get... I know colleagues will have an idea, but what we're looking for, and I get that point. I mean, there's a grey area there, because if the police were there, they say if it's a crime or about to be a crime, that would have been 999, that particular call.
Absolutely.
But, David, you're bursting to say something.
Okay, thanks, Steve. I think there are two key aspects to this. One is, within Hammersmith and Fulham, I would estimate that the police ASB data accounts for approximately 20% of the ASB universe. We have three other sources of ASB data. Two are through the council and one is through the housing department. They also measure the same area as the police and in some of the categories, but equally they measure other areas. And for instance, noise came up. Noise is a very big issue for us. Hammersmith and Fulham is the 6th densest borough in the country in terms of population per square whatever. So noise is an issue across the borough. In terms of trends, I think this is where it gets interesting and questions to look at. Picking up on what was just said, ease of reporting. I mean, Hammersmith and Fulham, our council have now developed an app called Report It. And you can also report ASB online. So the mechanisms and facilities for reporting have widened, have become more aware to the public, and as such, the public are embracing it. So fly tipping, for instance, we've seen a huge increase in reporting on fly tipping because it's much easier to do. You can get through to the council, you can register it and know that it's been registered. So I think the two key aspects here, Steve, is to stand back and look at the total universe of inputs to ASB. Two, to recognise that as you facilitate reporting and give people confidence that action will be taken, you may well see a rise in reporting, but that could be a good thing.
Okay, when others respond, you might want to give us an opinion about whether ASB... I'm sensing that there's an issue around under-reporting, potentially. Molly, did you have a point either about data or under-reporting, or both or either?
I think in terms of where you go, there's a couple of things here. One is that members of the public are required to go and report different types of ASB to different agencies. So police is just one of those. You've got environmental health, local authority, that could be an ASB or a housing team. So those are the places that you have to look, absolutely, in terms of reporting. One of the things that we don't have for ASB that we do for other types of crime is any sort of sense of under-reporting. We know that for different crime types. We don't know it for ASB. But then the next stage is actually to look at the impact of ASB, because we know that people who are impacted, it may be their mental health that's deteriorating. Those people may be accessing community services, they may be going into all sorts of other places, and it's actually maybe those kind of places that you might want to look at as well to get a bigger picture, I think.
Okay, sorry.
Just for example, though, just looking at our referral sources, nationally we only take 19% of referrals from the police. We take 70% from other agencies and 8% of self-referrals, but in London we take 23% of self-referrals.
So you said 70% from other agencies other than police?
Yes. So going back to the data picture, the police really are not the prime provider of support or problem solving. And I think this comes back as well to actually, if you're dealing with ASB, because these things all link, and the only way to address ASB is through multi-agency work that takes into account the victim, the perpetrator, and the environment or community. Therefore, any approach to look at data and to understand what's going on has to understand those things, because that will then later on help you to understand if it's working or not.
Okay.
Sorry, can I just back that up a little bit in terms of the fact that absolutely right, actually, because of the fact that we've pushed over recent years, particularly with the new ASB legislation coming in, that partnership working is so important. The police have got very good at understanding which partners might have better tools in the box to deal with the issue that's being reported to them. And actually residents learn that, so they will be going to their housing providers and the local authorities if they've got issues rather than going to the police. So if data is only coming from the police, it is going to look like it's going down because it's being reported elsewhere. Yeah, and the other thing I'd say, you asked the question about where can you get the data from. The problem with that is across housing providers and local authorities, there isn't any consistency in terms of what they're monitoring and how they're monitoring it. So there is an organisation called Housemark. I don't know if you've come across Housemark. They do some benchmarking. So some housing associations opt to be members and provide them with figures on terms of how many ASB cases they've had, how many have been closed, how long it's been taken to close. But again, that's a voluntary opt-in from housing associations.
I mean, what the sense there is that although the trend over some years has been reducing trend based on the Met figures, that's clearly been masked by the fact that there's increasing reporting elsewhere. So we're not getting a true... Kuljit, you wanted to come in, didn't you?
Yeah, so there are 2 points I'd make. The first is that as a lawyer, I often end up at the end of the ASB spectrum, as it were, and that other methods of enforcement have been tried, and it lands on my desk because an authority wants to seek an injunction or they want to seek a closure order or something else. And what I see are dozens and sometimes, and actually quite frequently, incidents running into the hundreds. And you might have 100, 200, 300 incidents that someone has diarised. And when you go back and look at, well, where has that been reported? Did you report that to your housing office or did you report that to the police? The answer very often is no. And it's either because they didn't know that they could report it, or they've reported it so many times, nothing's happened, that people give up on recording the information. And so I think there is very definitely an issue of under-recording of information and the incidence of ASB. And the other thing is just about the fact that when it comes to data, there's no central system for recording how many injunctions have been sought, how many closure orders have been sought, how many complaints of a certain type of ASB have there been. And whilst there are some organisations doing some work on an opt-in basis, and Paul's organisation in particular is a wealth of information in relation to who's doing what and how people are managing these problems, there needs to be some central way of recording the instance of ASB and an improvement and access to how people can report it.
Okay. Joe, did you want to come?
Yeah, I mean, like all housing providers, we have a system that records not only the type, the numbers, but also the location, so we know what borough it is, so we're able to track where reporting is actually happening. And I mean, I'm looking at the figures that I've got here going back to 13-14, and every year, like the Met, we've seen a reduction on average of around 400 cases a year reducing. So in 13-14, it was 2,700 cases in total, and in 16-17, it's only 1,441 that we've got reported. So it has actually been going down. What we've found, we've got 20 classifications, which we've got here, that my officers, when they get the report first comes in, they have to log it in one of those classifications. And I'm quite glad to give that out afterwards so everyone can know how those are actually recorded. And we do use Housemark, but I agree, it's voluntary. And one of the things we do track on there really is around how satisfied people are with the way that we actually handle their ASB cases and the cost of us actually handling that ASB case. The highest borough for us, the two highest boroughs we've got by far the most cases, but it's because we've got a lot of properties there, is Islington and Hackney. They're almost like they're in the premiership for us when it comes to ASB, and everybody else, it drops down dramatically after that.
But that kind of reflects it because that, a lot of your stock is there as opposed to other
And the
places.
type of stock.
Indeed. Molly, you wanted to come in just briefly?
Yeah, it's just one point that I think is really important, just following from the previous conversation, which is actually that while people might record loads of incidents in their own diaries, they are encouraged not to report those. You get issues where people get branded as repeat nuisance callers, and it then becomes them that's dealt with as the perpetrator. In ASB, particularly in cases where there are two individuals involved, it's often very hard to work out who is really a victim and who's a perpetrator. It gets very complex. And so I think we have to be really mindful that when we're looking at stats, people are not encouraged to report over a certain point. And so they'll then be sort of behaving themselves so as not to be branded a problem maker.
Okay. Susan, do you want to come in?
Yes, please. I've long been of the view that this is drastically underreported because I've dealt with it a lot in my borough. And Paul, right at the beginning, said that this is something that has to be dealt with in partnership. Completely agree with that. So since you're all singing from the same hymn sheet, where do you think a body should sit that does record this, because it is a very serious issue, and I'd love to know where you think a body that should collect all this data should sit. Where would that sit happily, that would be easy for all the different partners to access and to feed into?
Personally speaking, I think what's really worked well in London in the past is the consistency and the good practice that's been shared across London. There's been things like the ASB Managers Group, the ASB Board, the ASB Practitioners Group, which shared that good practice right across the London boroughs. And what was interesting was it was initially started off as being competitive. You know, one borough was better than the other borough because they used more tools and powers. And then another borough would use more early intervention and preventative stuff. So again, we started to try and find out what was, you know, the underlying issues of antisocial behaviour and how best to deal with it. London, over the sort of the years 2000, sort of early 2000s to the end of 2009, 2010, was reducing antisocial behaviour on the same level as Nottingham. You know, we got it absolutely right. And we got it right because there was a central leadership, there was a sort of focus on a London-wide approach rather than a borough-wide approach. And I take on board exactly what David was saying there about, you know, Hammersmith and Fulham are a notoriously good borough for dealing with antisocial behaviour. The problem is the consistency is not across London. So there's a bit of a lottery where you live and where you reside and where you work, where you have the response you're going to get. And I think we've lost that at the moment. We've lost that sort of overall picture of what is happening in London, from a nighttime economy related issue to street drinking to rough sleeping, right through to sort of young people standing on street corners, which I don't think is particularly a problem anymore in London, where it was initially about 10 years ago. But just sorry, to go back to what you were saying, one of the things when we ran the London ASB board, it was run from the Mayor's office, and that collected stats across the London boroughs to show who was actually using what tools and powers, not as a competitive thing, but to find out, you know, are they using them well? Is there lessons that can be learnt? How can they teach another borough that's not as competent to use those tools and powers? How can we use them more creatively in other areas? And what we found was that people wanted to belong to that particular group of people. Why? Because it had credibility, it had influence, we could change the way that London looked at specific things and prioritised certain things. And finally, just a quick example of that. The New Year's Eve used to be the biggest spike in disorder for the Met Police, but it wasn't. It was actually Guy Fawkes and Halloween was the biggest spike. And the London Antisocial Behaviour Board that was run by the Mayor's office prioritised that across London, and we actually reduced all disorder across that particular 2 days. So it was not even, it didn't show on the graphs as being a problematic time. And that only came about from partnership working, joint partnership working, sharing good practice, and everybody taking an ownership and responsibility of dealing with these issues, not stepping back when it wasn't their particular responsibility.
So I heard the Mayor's ASB board, Antisocial Behaviour Board, is that, I should know this, is that still extant? Is that still operative?
No, it's not. Unfortunately, the London ASB Practitioners Group, which I chaired, the London Managers Group, which I chaired, and the London ASB Board, which I helped with Jeanette with, unfortunately no longer exists. And I think because of that, the consistency has been lost. And we don't have that sort of one vision for London that we used to have.
Okay, thank you for that. Right, we're going to move on to the next set of questions that Peter's leading on, which is around perceptions of antisocial behaviour and the kind of disparities around London, Peter.
Right. Two reports, including the crime survey and MOPACs, have said that there is, contrary to what we might be saying, that there is a lessening of public concern about antisocial behaviour. I think you might already have answered bits of that, but can I ask maybe Paul to start with? Do you think that's right? Do you think there is a lessening? And if there is, what is the evidence for it?
I think it's probably been lessened because some people are dealing with it very effectively, which have been shown through Peabody. Some people are not dealing with it at all, so people are just fed up with reporting it, so there's been a decrease in numbers. And I think that's the complexity of antisocial behaviour. There's not one answer fits all. I think some issues are no longer as problematic as they used to be. There are other issues that weren't problematic in the past, which are now a major issue in certain London boroughs. Things like rough sleeping, street drinking, prostitution is on the rise. So I think it's a forever moving animal, antisocial behaviour, and that's why, unless you've got data to tell you what does the picture look like at this moment in time in London, you tend to react to people's opinions and historic information to tell you what the problem is, and that's why we tend to get it wrong, because we're dealing with an untrue picture.
So, sorry, rough sleeping is actually categorised as antisocial behaviour?
It can be. It's obviously, the vulnerability of it is obviously paramount, and we identify that. And those of us that work in antisocial behaviour, we don't criminalise people for rough sleeping in any way whatsoever. But there is problems with rough sleeping, and there's aggravating factors in relation to that. And we sometimes have to deal with that, because our responsibility is not only to the victims and the perpetrators, but obviously to the wider community and how it impacts on that. And I think what we don't want to do is, and I think what we're tending to go back to, which through the lessons of the Together campaign in the early 2000s, was we use enforcement action far too quickly. And I think it's about problem solving. It's about looking at the location, the individuals that are involved, and how best can we deal with the underlying issues that are causing the problems. And I think the agenda has reverted back to a statutory organisation response and housing providers, rather than in the past we had businesses. The Charlton Athletic Community Trust, when I worked with it, was responsible for the KICS project. They reduced antisocial behaviour in the borough of Greenwich by 28%, not by enforcement, but by intervention and early intervention and prevention. So again, I think that we haven't got a true picture, and because of that, we're dealing with it in the wrong way.
Can I just comment on your question about rough sleeping, because it's right that rough sleeping of itself isn't categorised as antisocial behaviour by everyone, although some will categorise it as antisocial behaviour, but it's an example of low impact antisocial behaviour which then has a knock-on impact and which can escalate if left unenforced. And I don't mean by litigation, but enforced by partnership working and other interventions. So rough sleeping, for example, has knock-on impact in terms of littering, potential drug use, which is potentially connected to thieving in the local area, potentially connected to drugs paraphernalia in the area, and so it goes on. And so if we don't deal with some of the lower impact issues, we are allowing them to escalate to a point where then there is a need for enforcement, whereas perhaps there could have been a different way of managing if we'd gone in at an earlier stage. So that partnership working is crucial. Just on rough sleeping. The other thing just to note is that there was an attempt to include rough sleeping in one of the London Local Authority's public space protection orders. And you may recall that there was a large public outcry in relation to that. And Liberty and others were involved in objecting to that having been done, and so that order was withdrawn. But it is a problem for the reasons that there are other acts of antisocial behaviour connected to it, and that rough sleeping is just one example of where there are knock-on impacts.
Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, just to answer your direction of your question in terms of the public perception of ASB. Yeah. We've recently conducted a number of street surveys in Hammersmith and Fulham, asking people their views on crime. And if you ask it as a spontaneous question, without any prompting, ASP doesn't really get much in the way of mention. If you put it on a prompted list, it rises up. And I think this is partly because the fact is, if you overlay ASB on a map, you get hotspots. I mean, they are concentrated in areas, ASB concentrated in areas of a borough, which means that other areas of the borough do not have the same level or thinking of ASB. And therein, I think, lies the rub, that For the majority of people, it's at a low level in their mind spontaneously. If you prompt them, yep, okay, they can start to engage with the notion of ASB. We haven't yet moved our survey into what I've described as the hotspots, and it'll be very interesting to see the responses we get when we actually move into hotter ASB areas.
But don't you think, though, when you say that they have to almost be prompted, or that it doesn't come up, ASB, much, could it just be that people have got used to it? I mean, this happens with, you know, if you've gone back to sort of like 30, 40 years, people might have said, oh, drugs are a big problem. Now, everyone is inured to it. I mean, and they probably don't mention it anymore. Do you think
I'm sure that's a possible factor. Yes, I think that's probably a factor. But I think equally, for a lot of people, it's not, when you give them an open-ended question on crime and safety, it's not top of their list.
I mean,
even near top.
Can I ask, sorry, perhaps Molly, is this, this is perception that it's no longer such a, you know, concern. Is this just in London, or is it a national thing? I mean, how do we figure, as it were, in London? Is there less concern in London?
You know, I couldn't answer that, and I think that probably the reason for that is that we don't have the surveys, or I don't think that's a known quantifiable thing. I think that one of the other challenges is that we call it antisocial behaviour, so there's a sense of this is happening out in society, and so this is affecting everyone, but actually a lot of it, particularly noise nuisance, does affect really localised communities, but the issue of perception is still really relevant in terms of that thing is going on there, or these events are happening, but how are people impacted? What is their anxiety in that moment? So I think it's a really hard question to.
Maybe you can just.
Sorry, so my organisation works across England and Wales. We represent around 250 housing associations who manage 3.5 million housing properties, so a fairly substantial amount of the social housing properties in England and Wales. And certainly before I came here today, I spoke to some of our London members to get a bit of a flavour about some of these questions. And certainly they were saying, although I don't know the methodology around how they do it, that when they do their questionnaires with the residents, ASB is coming top alongside disrepair. They're their two issues in terms of housing management. And certainly that is the same that we hear across the whole of our membership. Across England and Wales, our social housing tenants are still saying that ASB is an issue. And I think one of the things that we haven't spoke about, and it's really important that we raise it at some point, is the impact that austerity has had. So we've seen neighbourhood policing decimated, we've seen local authorities cut to the bone, we've seen housing currently going through efficiency savings because of the rent decrease policy and the fact they've had to lower their rents, which is their main source of income. And actually, I think in the sector there is a real concern that priority is off ASB, it's now on modern slavery, CSE, understandably, but that actually if we take the priority and the focus off ASB too much, we're going to be at the start of another roller coaster where we could unfortunately end up with a Fiona Pilkington case before the focus comes back on again. And as professionals who are very passionate about what we do, that is absolutely the last thing we want to see happening.
Can I just come in on perception as well? Because I think part of it is when you ask a member of the public, well, are you affected by antisocial behaviour? I think to an extent that's the wrong question to ask, because would they categorise littering as antisocial behaviour? Would they categorise seeing the discarded containers of legal highs antisocial behaviour? Would they categorise seeing syringes and baggies antisocial behaviour? Perhaps there is a sense of them becoming immune to it to an extent, but I think it's also about how we ask the question, because they aren't necessarily going to consider that those things, for example, are antisocial behaviour.
Can I ask, I mean, if I can just be indulged here a bit, Steve, you know, you mentioned about hotspots, but it seems to be one of the flashpoints of antisocial behaviour is the public transport system. And I wondered, therefore, you were talking about the problems of reporting. How actually do people actually report things that happen on the train or tube? I mean, at least in my experience, you know, commuting, going around London, a lot of antisocial sort of things I would call antisocial happen on public transport. I mean, you know, if I could just explain, I mean, you know, in the past life as a journalist, I did a big feature about anti-social behaviour on transport. The whole point of it, taking my life in my hands really, was to actually sort of like ask people to stop doing things, as it were, in the most courteous way possible. And what that was things such as speaking incredibly loudly on a mobile phone, which seems to be endemic now, often using really violent language, I mean, profanities and such. I would call that antisocial behaviour. But there seemed to have been some kind of moral inversion. I was the rude person for asking you know? I mean, I don't know whether this is something that you recognise, this situation, that somehow or other people have now a kind of sense of obliviousness about the public sphere. I mean, particularly in relation to transport is what I'm talking about.
If you remember back, I think it was 2011, Transport for London did a big promotion across the underground in relation to not putting feet on seats and things like that, which actually worked. And I think what we tend to forget with antisocial behaviour is most people don't do it purposely. They do it because of an underlying issue in their lives, whether it's mental health vulnerability, whether it's alcoholism, whether it's unemployment. There's something that's going on in their lives that's making them antisocial to other people. Now, there are people that go out there and purposely be antisocial, and we can deal with that through enforcement action. But I do think it's about education, and it's about talking about respecting others and sort of getting people to think first before they actually do things. And in the early sort of 2000, I designed a concept called acceptable behaviour contracts, and that was about us not only talking to people but also listening to people and finding out why they were causing problems in the first place. And I think most people didn't realise there was consequences to their actions, especially young people. And we had about a 90% success rate, mainly because there was a consequence to their actions if it was going to continue. But I think it was about building relationships, and it was about talking to people and telling them what impact their behaviour had on other people. Now, again, I emphasise that a small percentage will go out there and they won't care anyway, and they'll still be problematic. But we've got enforcement action to do that. And if you look at the new tools and powers, the civil injunction is available to Transport for London, so they should be using them. It's also available to the British Transport Police, so we shouldn't be just relying on the Metropolitan Police in London to do this. So there's a number of people actually that now have availability to use these tools and powers. NHS Protect is another one, for example. So why are we not holding these people accountable as well? Not for going for enforcement action, but just joining the table and problem solving some of these particular issues. And where necessary, in the small minority cases where we have to take action, they are equal partners in that process. Well, the Home Office did some statistics on it, and they found that about 83% of all antisocial behaviour was dealt with effectively through 3 interventions, and that didn't have to result in enforcement action. And I think what we've done is we've gone straight back into the old days of Together, where we tackle and we don't tolerate antisocial behaviour. And we're sort of monitored on our effectiveness on how we use enforcement action.
We've got a set of questions on tackling.
Right,
okay.
The thing is,
I'm
interested you say that it comes from problems in people's lives. I mean, don't you think, I mean, I'd be interested in any comments, don't you think that there's sort of, I'm talking about like transport, this is very specific, but it affects us all. There's been a sort of breakdown, if you like, in what you might call, used to be called peer pressure. I mean, you know, that basically there were certain things that maybe people knew this, you shouldn't really do this, whatever. And my sense really is that people now are just simply frightened to ask people, because it's not like you don't want to intrude or anything, it's just they're frightened of what will happen to them if they do, you know, they get knifed or whatever.
I think, can we just hold that one, because we've got a whole bunch of questions around tackling antisocial behaviour, and I think this is, we're going into that area, because I wanted really just to look at perceptions, and what I'm hearing is, even though the figures are saying that the kind of perception from the public is reducing, that isn't really a true analysis of how Londoners in your capacity are feeling about antisocial behaviour. They're still concerned, and they're worried about the rise, and you talked about austerity, and you'll be very pleased that particularly this committee is going to spend a lot of time shining a light on antisocial behaviour, which I think
what I would say, though, just really quickly, is that when you ask these questions of residents, you need to understand what else is going on within that organisation.
Yes.
So when we ask our residents at the moment, what are the issues that are most important to you, repairs jumps right to the top of the list. And that's because the contractors that we've got, we're working hard for them to improve the service.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it really depends what else is going on there. So for us at the moment, ASB is 3rd on the list for us. It doesn't mean that it's great, it just means that we've got other issues that we're trying to tackle that's impacting on
that's really thoughtful. Okay, that's really helpful. Right, moving on to the next set of questions, which is really about who experiences antisocial behaviour. Some questions around that. Sian, you're the lead initially, aren't you?
Yeah, my first question, if it's okay, because you've touched on in some of your answers already the fact that there might be sort of deeper root causes for this, and actually Joe from Peabody, I think one of the things you were saying was essentially that in some cases that the behaviour is not the problem. The housing that doesn't separate people in terms of noise is actually the problem. The behaviours are perfectly normal, but they're causing annoyance. Some of you have mentioned mental health. Some of you have mentioned just austerity in general. I wondered if maybe I could start with Janine. Are there other underlying causes that are pushing some of these behaviours to the fore and maybe leading to increases in certain kinds of antisocial behaviour being seen?
I mean, we cannot avoid talking about mental health. I mean, it's under a factor in almost, well, I'm not going to say almost all ASB cases, but a significant amount of ASB cases tend to circle around mental health issues. The problem that we've got are twofold. One, it's about understanding. So actually, if you are a housing officer who is not trained in mental illness or support or dealing with that, then there's a level of fear about taking the wrong step, doing the wrong thing, making the situation worse, stigmatising someone. There's also a massive issue around the thresholds that some mental health agencies apply. So actually, as a housing officer, you might come across somebody who, in your eyes, has some real clear and apparent mental health issues. But when you try desperately to seek support for that, put referrals in, you're actually told by the agencies that they don't meet the thresholds. And actually, in some really unfortunate situations, we've got housing providers that are being forced to take action against tenants that they don't want to because they're vulnerable and have got mental health issues. But in their eyes, that's the only way that they're going to get them raised up the threshold that the agencies are actually going to start working with them, or it might be the only way to get a mental health assessment. And I think that is one of the biggest problems for any community safety professional at the moment, particularly what we see in housing, is this mental health issue, which is getting bigger and bigger, and actually we no longer have the resource or the understanding to properly grab it and deal with it.
You've got to remember as well, when safeguarding impacts on the community, it becomes antisocial behaviour. And if you look at the whole safeguarding agenda at the moment, it's massively on the increase. We've got people being put into general housing that would normally in the past be put in specialist housing or sheltered supportive housing. We've got a huge mental health issue at the moment, as you know, in London, and that's impacting on antisocial behaviour. And I think that's the danger when you talk about antisocial behaviour. And I think there was a consultation that the Mayor's Office put out that put antisocial behaviour and speed in vehicles, and it kind of undermined what the whole ASB agenda is about. Antisocial behaviour is about risk, it's about managing risk, it's about vulnerability, it's about repeat victimisation. If you look at what's now happening across London, 22 London boroughs have now adopted community MARICs, which are multi-agency risk assessment conferences. They haven't adopted them because they sound pretty or they want to be part of yet another meeting. They work because they manage risk, an unknown risk that's actually on the boroughs. And what we're finding now, with spending a little bit of money up front, we can actually avoid having to spend large amounts of money down the line with mental health trusts, with adult safeguarding boards, etc., with hoarding, with all sorts of issues. So the antisocial behaviour agenda, it has a massive underlying reasons behind it. It's, I could list about 50 that causes antisocial behaviour. But the main thing about it is it's now being dealt with at a professional level, cross-borough, where boroughs are talking to each other about individuals that have got high vulnerability. And they could be a perpetrator themselves, or they could actually just be a victim. But we've lost the focus, and I think, in relation to that. And we need this, I think part of this should be looking at, is this still a victim-focused agenda in London? And I would say it's probably reverting back to an enforcement-focused approach against perpetrators. And that's the danger, because we learned that in the 2000s. We need to learn the lessons from that point.
Should we go along to you, David? Do you have any views on some of the underlying causes that you've seen in terms of new behaviours that have come out or things that have been increasing?
To be honest, I was thinking about that, and I'm afraid I'm not sure I could add anything at this time on that point.
Okay.
I would agree with everything that was said before, and I think that one of the problems with ASB in this broadness is just the absolute complexity of it, because it's linked to housing, it's linked to education, it's linked to work and opportunities, it's linked to the way people are embraced in society. So, for example, we know that in terms of prejudice-related antisocial behaviour, about a third of the cases that victim support receive in London have got an element of prejudice associated. You know, it's really complex. And so how do you understand all of them? There are just too many, but I would just really emphasise that the mental health is one of the biggest things in terms of vulnerability, because if you imagine that you've got somebody whose mental health is deteriorating for all of these range of reasons, and there aren't the services due to austerity or whatever it is available for them to get access when they just are starting to need that, then where's that going to display? And it's going to display in their immediate environment, and that is with their neighbours or in their immediate community. And so then the things that probably wouldn't have been branded antisocial behaviour or be dealt with by antisocial behaviour teams are now coming into that remit because they're the ones that are there. There are still enough housing officers and ASB officers to be in that immediate environment to pick people up, but they're not trained. One of the things I'd say in terms of good practice, Islington has got a clinical psychiatrist in their housing team, and they're there for precisely this reason, because they understand that housing officers deal with mental health now in the community.
So where was that, sorry?
Islington.
Islington, okay.
And that's working really well, and all the other agencies can join into that, because I think everyone would agree with everything else going on is mental health. And I think the other thing that people haven't yet mentioned is actually suicide. There has been no study to look at how many people have committed suicide where the ASB was present. We just don't know it. And actually that's a really important factor that, you know, could be considered in terms of the end reaching point of mental health.
Joe, perhaps you can tell us some more about the housing issues. Yeah. Particularly one of the types of antisocial behaviour that we've seen and people complain about is young people just existing or being out in the street.
Existing, yes. Yeah.
Are there housing related issues that are pushing people?
Most definitely. I mean, to be honest, I've been in housing now for around 30 years, and it really has changed. If you speak to any housing officer now, they will tell you they deal with mental health more as an issue now than ever before. And because of that, we've actually got a team that supports any households when we know that there's a problem there, so we can keep their tenancy there instead of them losing it for actually ASB. But at Peabody, we've also got about 1,000 homes that are specifically for ex-rough sleepers. I know it's already been mentioned here, and it's not that they're a greater problem, but they do bring other problems with them. Maybe not with the actual tenant themselves, but with the people that they hang around with, and then they'll bring that on to our estates or into our homes. One of the things that hasn't been mentioned is overcrowding. Overcrowding for us is a real issue, and if you're going to go back to young people, I've got 2 sons myself. They're lucky they've got their own rooms. If you haven't got your own rooms and you're trying to bring your friends around, you can't. The only thing you can do is go out into the communal areas with your friends, and they just may be allowed. Young people are allowed. But the tolerance level for people, especially who are older, it's just not the same. So, I mean, we have wardens, we have our own wardens. If we have particular issues on the estates, we will direct those wardens to actually do patrols with the Safer Neighbourhood teams as well, and we're able to move those on. But all you're really doing, you're not dealing with the antisocial behaviour, you're moving it on to somewhere else, which is why it's important to have partnership working with other landlords, the police and everybody else, because we really need some intervention for those youngsters. Otherwise, they're just going to be hanging around on the street somewhere else. We're not really dealing with the actual issue.
Okay, and are you trying to address the noise between flats issue as a landlord?
It is. We've got, I think the last time was around 12 of my staff that have been trained as mediators. So one of the first things we'll do, as soon as we identify that it is just normal domestic noise, we will ask both of the households to get together for mediation. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes there's one household who said, I do not want to play a part in this, just get them to change the way they actually. But when we do get them together, I'd say a high percentage of the time, the mediation can actually work. Because a lot of the time, the person causing the noise has no idea the impact that they're having on somebody. And we've actually gone into people's homes and sent some of our staff upstairs and just say, we're on the phones, start walking around now while we're actually in the property with the person, and then you can just hear the floorboards creaking, or you can hear the tricycle going across, and it's at that point that the person realises what the impact is. And then they change. They'll put rugs down, or they'll tell their children, don't play in the front room, go into the bedroom and play, because it doesn't impact when somebody's trying to watch Coronation Street or EastEnders. But mediation works.
Okay, that's useful to know. I'm a local councillor, so this is
But we've had to train our own. We've had to train our own because it's not free. So if we try and go to a third party, we have to pay for it. So the cheaper option for us was to train our own and get it to work that way.
Yeah. Kuljit, do you have anything to add?
I think there are 2 points I'd make. I'd agree with everything that's been said so far, but first relates to social housing and the other one relates to education and training. And on social housing, not all the problems are related to social housing, but historically what's happened is that more and more units of social housing have been bought under the right to buy. And so we've got different types of tenure going on in what were conventionally, historically, dedicated local authority blocks. So you've got a block a flat within a block that's been bought by the individual that was the tenant. They might then have lived in it for a while and then sublet it, which they're entitled to do. And so you've got local authority tenants, people who are owner-occupiers, and then you've got subtenants of owner-occupiers all within the same block. So I think people's the people aren't accustomed to the sorts of behaviour that might have gone in the block, gone on in the block historically, because they've come as someone who's paying a commercial rent for a particular property. So that's going on, and that's affecting, I think, what people are prepared to tolerate and what people are prepared to complain about. And what's happening is that you have articulate individuals going in who are maybe private renters who are more capable of making their concerns known to the powers that be. That's one trend. The other thing about social housing and mental health is that social housing is like gold dust. And so to get social housing, in terms of the statutory provisions, that you have to be in what's called priority need. Priority need, one of the big categories of priority need is vulnerability. And so the route into social housing means that you have to demonstrate that you're vulnerable. And in many, many cases, that is vulnerability by reason of mental illness. And so you are ending up with a large proportion of people with mental health difficulties in social housing next door to the owner-occupier or next door to the person who is renting their flat from their landlord. And there needs to be a level of support, not just for the perpetrator, but who has the mental illness, but also for victims who may well have that mental illness. And again, going back to the impact on that individual. And part of that, the answer is mediation, about understanding what's going on in each other's lives and different lifestyles. But part of that is ensuring there's the right support. And that takes me to my point about education and training, because it's quite pleasing to hear that officers have been trained in mental health and have got mediation skills. But that's not the picture across the board. And I know that when the Act first came in, we were involved as the Chambers in doing a lot of training across the country on the new tools and powers. And one of the comments that was consistently made is that there is a lack of training, not just about the tools, but also about mental health, also things like mediation. Officers just aren't equipped to deal with these things unless they've had specific training, and that of itself leads into budgets and the resources available to do that. The other point about training is that it's about making people understand, probably at a school level, that putting your feet on the seats of a bus or a tube is not acceptable behaviour. And sort of some level of education at that level is also needed to make people understand what is acceptable in terms of society.
Can I just come in one other point? Just a new trend that Peabody is seeing now, Airbnb. We have got so many people that are renting properties from Airbnb for the weekend and then having parties.
Yeah. Is that a significant source of complaint?
Oh, it's
that you measure?
It's rising now.
Wow.
It's just come from nowhere, the way the things have changed now there. But it's now people will actually rent properties, because we have some properties in some really nice areas. And then they just rent it for the weekend for a few days, and then they go in and they have their parties. And that doesn't just impact on the people around the flat, that impacts on the whole of the estate, because they will have the legal highs, they will have all those things, the noise that goes on with it. And then by the time you get in there, the party's done, and then you're really then tackling the illegal subletting that's been going on there. So but it does impact on the whole of the estate. But I would say almost every week now, there's an Airbnb party going on in one of my properties.
I think Tom wants to come in on that particular point, don't you?
I was going to raise Airbnb because it's something that I've been doing some work on at City Hall. I mean, do you think? I mean, if we've got this growing problem with it, do you think that we need to start looking at legislation, which would mean, for example, if you want to rent out your property, you need to get a license or something like that? Do you think those kind of powers would help?
I would rather we didn't allow them to rent out their properties in the first place. That would be it for me. Because again, where Peabody has its properties, subletting is a really big issue for us.
But hang on though, with Peabody, I mean, is it already against the terms of the tenancy to rent out on Airbnb? I was talking more generally.
It's not. No, it's not.
It's not against the terms.
But the clauses that we have in our tenancy agreement means we can't deal with it quickly.
Right.
Most social landlords will have a prohibition on subletting.
Yes.
And so, but the problem with Airbnb is it's for a night or two.
Correct.
And so you don't discover it. Where it's subletting with let someone in for 3, 6 or longer months, that's different. So social housing already has a prohibition on subletting, and you're supposed to use your property as your principal home. So you can have more than one home, but you're supposed to live there as your main residence. In terms of licensing, in answer to that question, there is already the option to do what's called, to sign up to a selective or additional licensing scheme for landlords. But it's optional. So some local authorities have adopted it and others haven't. But if that were the requirement and the legislation exists, then that could be one way to manage it, is by having conditions on a licence.
Thank you.
Just going to say, Westminster have got, they've been doing some proactive stuff in relation to Airbnb, but also the pop-up brothels, which are being used in the same way, and also the cuckooing side of things, which where you've got a vulnerable person that's had their property taken over by a criminal gang. And that's, I've just done some training outside of London, in Kent and Wiltshire, and they're having massive problems with London gangs now moving out and targeting their vulnerable residents. But just going back to Westminster, they're looking at using the tools and powers, specifically the community protection notice, in relation to getting the landlord to take more responsibility in relation to what they do with their particular properties, and they're having some success with that.
What we've heard, I've heard from residents groups on Airbnb, is it's not just, the loud parties that might happen. It's also people not knowing where to put the bins out, people leaving doors open and not closing them properly because they don't know, they don't live there, so they don't know how the block works. So I guess that would also maybe fall into one of the things that people might not necessarily regard as antisocial behaviour, but it is causing problems for residents.
Yeah, definitely.
Peter, you want to come in?
Yes. Just simply for my clarity, you talked about mental health and how important it was generally to antisocial behaviour. Can you just tell me what are we talking about with the particular conditions? What particular mental health problems are the most common, if you like?
Fair, the most problematic are undiagnosed mental health problems because they don't fall into a neat box. So there's no medication that can be given. It might be classed as a personality disorder, or there's no service that can particularly go in and help. For housing, hoarding's a massive problem, and although hoarding in itself isn't an ASB issue, when it starts meaning that you've got infestations because of the smell, or someone walks past the building, there's a really strong odour. I've had people defecating in toilets because their toilet in their property is so overflowing that they can't use their facilities. So hoarding's a massive issue for social housing as well.
So diagnosed issues, paranoid schizophrenia and bipolar disorder are the two big ones when they are diagnosed, but I absolutely agree with Janine that the big part of the problem is the undiagnosed mental health issues.
Depression, anxiety as well, or what?
Not so much, but the things with bipolar and paranoid schizophrenia are that you often have people talking to themselves, sometimes chanting, sometimes playing noise in order to get loud music in order to get away from the voices in their head. That sort of behaviour which is having a knock-on impact on others.
Just in addition to that, what is a big problem with antisocial behaviour is when people have these particular disorders, they're undiagnosed, or they don't want to have any help or support, and an adult can refuse support. And so that's the difficult case where we know there's a particular problem, we know there's a treatment that this person or medicine this person can have, but they're refusing to comply. And that, if you speak to many housing providers, that is the main number one concern, is where people will not willingly come for help and support when they know there's a particular problem and it spirals out of control.
And just to add to that very quickly, and sorry because I'm kind of straddling into talking about tools and powers, but one of the big pushes with the new tools and powers was that the injunction and the criminal behaviour order, where you were going to be able to apply for positive requirements in them. So actually there was an absolute understanding that with lots of ASB there's an underlying issue. So let's make the tools that we've got to deal with it very balanced. So I can stop you doing something, but I can also make you do something like go to a support service. It sounds fantastic on the tin, but again, if you work in areas where those support services don't longer exist, or you're actually struggling to get the cooperation of the support service because they don't understand your intention behind what you're trying to do, they think you're trying to criminalise their client, and actually it's really difficult to engage. And one of the biggest problems that our members are having with the new tools and powers is that they really want to include that supportive element to the order, but they just can't get the cooperation or the service isn't there.
Can I add one point on mental health as well, which is that actually it's around the impact and perception, because as something starts to continue, people's mental health without need of diagnosing can be impacted in terms of the depression, anxiety that you mentioned, which can mean that the perception kind of increases and things start to upset them more, or and then it can tie around, so the person perpetrating or the person that's the victim gets more upset. And so little things that no one would describe as antisocial behaviour might then become part of a pattern of behaviour, and so this whole scenario can get really compacted and can expand, and so it's that stuff as well.
Right.
Just really quickly, because I know you're taking notes on some of the good practices. Peabody leads on a pan-London hoarding group. So we have Mind that turn up there, we have other registered providers, and we have Age Concern and other groups, and we meet quarterly to do stuff around hoarding, so in case you want to...
This is really important. I mean, the mental health point is well made, and we take that as part of that evidence. Charlotte, you want to continue with your
Yes, I
thoughts?
have a couple more questions about prevalence. I know we've slightly talked about the overall prevalence and different types of antisocial behaviour, but is there anything any of you would like to say about the difference in prevalence across different parts of London, the geographical spread? I think David maybe touched on that a little bit earlier on, in terms of how different boroughs are dealing with it. But are there different causes in different parts of London, different types of antisocial behaviour that are more prevalent in some places than others?
I think from our point of view, we've got work to do to start to, as I say, you can identify hotspots, but I think we've got more work to do to actually layer the various degrees or levels of antisocial behaviour to those hotspots. So for us, there's a large part of the borough where you would look at fly tipping, littering as being probably an important area. You get hits on that. Whereas if you went into the more concentrated social housing areas, then more general noise and other ASB would be seen around there. But we need to do more work to actually start to, in real time, identify those areas.
Yeah, we certainly couldn't find a lot to tell us about that in our briefing.
Yeah.
What's really, I love London because it's got such variety, and as I say, antisocial behaviour tends to be the same right across the city, but you do get little pockets of uniqueness, if I think is probably the best way. I used to work in Ealing, and we had obviously problems with people living in back gardens and sheds and garages, and I went then to Kensington and Chelsea and dealt with £1 million sports cars being driven around Harrods, doing wheel spins and things like that. And so I think there is a variety of different types, but when you look at the core group, it's usually the same right across. There's just different tolerances in relation to that. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's been anything different that's come out of the last few years in relation to antisocial behaviour, except maybe the child sexual exploitation aspect of it. Certainly the hate crime is very much being linked with the ASB agenda. And also, as I said before, the cuckooing type thing, the vulnerability, the people's properties being taken over, which is part of what they call the county lines problem, which is a national problem, but certainly centres around some of the criminality that's going on in London.
One thing that we've noticed, and we've discussed a bit in this committee, that really seems to have happened in Islington and Camden and maybe spreading further is moped-related antisocial behaviour. We'll maybe get on to talking about that later in terms of how it's being solved. Certainly in my area there's a problem-solving attitude being taken to it because it is quite complicated. But is there anything anyone here would like to say about mopeds and the fact that it seems to be a sort of a trend as opposed to something that has an underlying cause?
Again, I used to work in Islington. That's where I worked as a police officer, and that's where we started the acceptable behaviour contracts. Islington was mainly problematic because it's very much located next to the city. And when I used to be there, 15, 20 years ago now, we used to have 300 mopeds stolen a month from the city into Islington, and it was a major problem. It always will be a problem until the manufacturers make mopeds more difficult to steal. And they were always reluctant to do that because they made more money replacing stolen mopeds than actually making them in the first place. So that tells you something. But also, again, going back to the ABC scheme, we did a moped package where young people who were using mopeds in a way that was detrimental to the community, there was a package of interventions that was available to them as an incentive, but also there was a consequence to their actions if they continue to do so. And we found that the majority of kids went for the incentive, and that's why I keep emphasising the fact that we don't, antisocial behaviour is not all about punishment, it's about incentives, it's about education, it's about telling people what impact they're having, and on the majority of people, they will actually move away, they will stop doing what they're doing because they didn't realise it was having that problem.
I contribute on mopeds because I think it's not just mopeds, I think it's mopeds go-peds, micro-scooters, go-karts, all of those four-wheeled things that aren't cars, and young people. And Croydon's got an example of good practice where a few years ago they sought ASBOs, youth ASBOs, on 5 of their most prolific moped riders. And one of the issues that came out of that is, well, how are these vehicles being bought? And what we established is actually there seems to have been, certainly in that case, a very lackadaisical attitude by parents and grandparents who were purchasing these things at hundreds of pounds at a time, or they were being stolen by the young people. And so the ASBOs worked. The other thing that had, we think, the most impact is that we decided to publicise the ASBOs, and those young people had their pictures and details of their ASBOs put up in various places, including on the door of the local police station. And that had the most effective impact, because suddenly we had so-and-so's mum that hadn't taken any interest in what her son was doing on a day-to-day basis, had been purchasing these vehicles for him, ringing up to say, why is my son's picture on, and suddenly starting to engage. And that, I think, is part of the problem, is that when we've identified perpetrators, is getting them to engage. And so if, in terms of good practice, mopeds, Croydon certainly has a good example of how they've dealt with it in their area. Is it a trend? I think it's a problem probably across most areas, probably really concentrated on young people. And there are ways such as the ABC to get access to them early on, but part of that is dependent on them and their parents or guardians engaging in that process.
You know, I may have misunderstood.
You don't want to get too sidetracked by mopeds.
No, I don't.
At this point.
I may have misunderstood the question, but in Hackney, let's say, we've noticed that it's not so much that the kids are driving around on making noise and stuff, but they're using these as vehicles of choice to commit crimes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's a different
and that's
issue,
and
but
that's the thing with us.
Just briefly, just say we're starting a new initiative to actually put tracking chips on mopeds, rather like your bike mark, but these are actually electronic tracking chips, and we're going to start to work with moped owners to put those on.
Yet another wonderful initiative out of Hammersmith and Fulham, David. And I admire that. And I remember the Croydon initiative, whopping ASBOs on the moped users on the commons, and Mum saying, why on earth, Jimmy, on a picture in the paper. Now let's move.
Can I ask my final question, though? Because it's about what...
I thought that was your final question.
No,
Phoebe.
I haven't. I've asked about geographical spread, but we need... I know we talked a lot about people with mental health problems, but are there any other groups who are particularly likely to, A, be victims, or B, be accused in maybe a discriminatory way of antisocial behaviour?
In London, there's two main groups that have a possibility of being victims in relation to antisocial behaviour as well as mental health. That's people with disabilities who are picked on, and young people are more likely to be victims of antisocial behaviour than perpetrators. And that's been proved over a number of different surveys over the years. And they're also more fearful of antisocial behaviour in London than adults are.
No, thank you. And anyone?
I would just add, I was going to say similar stuff, so I would just add in people with drugs and alcohol. So from surveying our clients, we know that about 60 to 80% of perpetrators were identified as having drug and alcohol problems, which is obviously a really significant number. So I think anyone who's in a kind of slightly chaotic lifestyle as well would be...
Okay, right, good. Susan.
Okay, we can look at the victims more now. Do you think that the police, other partners like their housing partners and the local authorities, do you think they have a good understanding of the feelings around the victims, of the damage it can do to victims? Or is more emphasis always put on the perpetrators? Anybody?
I can go to some... I mean, I would say that there are examples where individuals or boroughs are excellent, and then there are all of the rest of it. And I think the answer is a resounding no, because when people are coming into our services, they're incredibly vulnerable. They're scoring high on risk and vulnerability factors. And key issues are the fact that people aren't believing them, that agencies aren't working together, and there's no communication. So, I mean, as a starting point, it's complex. If you're living in a situation where you're experiencing antisocial behaviour, it's probably multifaceted. You probably have to report to a number of different organisations at different times. We rarely see that those organisations and that information is linked up, which prevents a picture from being created, and it means that you know, they're undermined by the structures as well as the kind of knowledge. Which I would say the kind of community Marek work that Paul's been doing is amazing, where we've got cases that can go into a community Marek. That's where you see good practice, and those people who are working in the community Mareks, the professionals who get used to working police, housing, mental health, our services where they exist, get used to coming together and sharing information. That's how it should be. But across the board, I think the answer is no. Even in terms of getting information on the cases they have reported, getting believed, again, no. And I think problematically, because people aren't understood, the complexity of why they're perpetrating or why they're the victim doesn't get addressed. People tend to want to go down enforcement. So one of the areas I would say in terms of the victim's work, in terms of antisocial behaviour that's really fundamental, is that if you're the victim of crime, you've got rights under the Victims Code of Practice. You get an instant referral into victim services. You have got an advocate. You've got somebody that's going to identify all your needs and all your risks, and they're going to make sure that you're put into the right services that meet your need. They're going to help you through the criminal justice system, and you'll get help through courts. But because antisocial behaviour is being classed not only as criminal but predominantly as a statutory issue, it gets dealt with through the courts and these other agencies. People do not have access to those rights. There is no commission service, not only in London but in other parts of the country, for those people, and so they don't have that advocate service and the support service that's developed for victims of crime over a large number of years. And so there's just huge gaps in terms of provision, and so then you can't somehow blame all of the professionals because they don't have that basic infrastructure underneath to support them. But that has a huge impact on victims. We know that people come in very vulnerable, you know, experiencing, our stats say that it's sort of 82% to 100% of people experiencing ASB most of the time, most days. You know, it's really significant, but that stuff is just not getting addressed.
And I think I'd completely back up what Molly's just said in terms of that. And actually, after cases like Fiona Pilkington, there were a number of recommendations made as a result of that, lessons learned. And one of the things that was brought in was the idea that we needed to be better at assessing victims and their vulnerabilities. So actually across the board now, whether it's police, housing, local authority, most will be using a form of victim vulnerability assessment, which is great. But unfortunately what happens if someone is picked up as being a medium or a high risk, you then get this issue of, well, where do we send them to? Because actually we've already identified, we've got a piece of paper that's telling us clearly that we as housing officers don't have the specialisms to offer the support that this person needs. But who do we refer it to? And I know Baroness Newlove, the Victims Commissioner, has been doing a huge amount of work around this in terms of recognising that you're absolutely right, if you're a victim of crime. And let's be honest, some crimes don't have the impact that ASB has, where you probably don't need the level of support that you're going to be offered. And then ironically, when you're a victim of ASB where you would value that support and really need it, you're not getting it because the money's not put into that direction.
No, London is an absolute postcode lottery. We have currently got local authorities and as well MOPAC in some cases funding 8 members of staff, but that's where you've got a local authority or a housing team that really understand the need to put victims at the centre of ASB work, and it's fundamental. If you want to solve a problem, you need to understand what's happening for the victim, both in terms of them experiencing something, but to prevent them from perpetrating and preventing the community going well. But for everyone that doesn't live in those boroughs, they have got no advocate and they've got no one that's pulling their case together. And so people just despair and they don't know where to go. I mean, the other problem is that professionals don't even know where to report. If you ask most professionals, even within the housing and with the police sector, okay, these incidents of ASB have happened, who would you go to? Would you go to the police? Would you go to environmental health? Or would you go to your housing officer? They won't know. So how can they help then the victims? It's so complex and it's completely unjoined up, except in these small examples. For example, Marek, which I just couldn't express how useful that is and how much that works.
Just historically, if I could comment that I think we're failing victims, and one of the drivers of the new legislation, and if one looks at the white paper, the consultation and a lot of the parliamentary debates, which I did as part of my bedtime reading for writing the book, that it was very much around the fact that victims were being forgotten and falling between the lines, as Molly's already said, and going back to what we were talking about at the outset about how one defines antisocial behaviour, because victims have often got to the point where they've reported to several different agencies, and the idea behind the legislation was that there would be better partnership working, and with the exception of some examples of good practice, that's not happening, and that's why I think we're failing victims, because they're having to repeatedly report, or they get to a point where they simply stop reporting.
Just very quickly, just pick up that point, apologies. I think even where you've got areas that have historically been very good at partnership working, some of those links have broken down because of the austerity issues. So unfortunately what happens is when money is tight, people go back into their silos, and that's the opposite of what they should be doing. We should be pooling our resources and working more together. And the second thing that I just need to raise is the issue around information sharing, and again how patchy that is. So I've been working in ASB for 12 years. Every time we go out to our members and say what is the biggest problem, it is always information sharing. So even where agencies want to work in partnership and there's a real appetite to do it, there is this blocker where they can't get the information they need to be able to deal with the problem properly.
So again, if there was an overarching panel, as there used to be, if that was around, would that be able to signpost people from various different boroughs as to where there could be assistance?
The benefit was that you publicised across the key individuals in each of the London boroughs what good practice was happening, and there is still a network in existence now, but it's not official. Hasn't got that sort of influence that it used to have. There's a number of London boroughs now adopting new case management systems. There's about 5 have the same case management system. Trident have just adopted the same case management system called ESONS, which is about sort of identifying and managing risk in a relation to a number of different things, but specifically antisocial behaviour. And it's giving people the opportunity not to have to constantly approach other organisations and persuade them to give information. It throws the responsibility on the agencies that have that information to share it back. And I think I take on board exactly, and I agree wholeheartedly, in austerity as well, we revert back into those isolated ways of working, and that's very evident at the moment. And we don't share information, we become precious, and that's when you have the recipe for disaster like Pilkington's. That showed that everybody was still doing their jobs, but they just weren't doing it in a coordinated way or sharing information with others.
But just in answer to your question about what would a central panel, what purpose would it serve, part of it is collection of data so that we understand who's doing what and what the instance of ASB is. But the other part of it is exactly that, sharing examples of good practice so that one can see, well, this is how this borough's dealt with this. We've got exactly the same problem. How could we deal with this? And the other purpose the panel served when it existed was education, in terms of someone like me or others would go in and do a presentation to say, well, we've just been working on this is how it's worked, these are the outcomes. And people would be able to learn about what other areas are doing to tackle the problems that they had in their own areas. And that's lacking. That joined up centralised information exchange is really lacking.
Next one.
Please do.
If we look at the other end of the scale, still victims, is any work being done on expectation management? Because but given that resources are low everywhere, and we understand why, given that I was given a wonderful example by one of our researchers. Last night, in the middle of the night, a load of kids came down the road making a lot of noise. And he said to elderly, that would have been real antisocial behaviour. He thought it's just a load of kids going down the road. And I do think that we do have to manage the other end of it in order to put resources in the serious end of it. Is any work being done on how we can manage these things? That clearly the police, nobody could do anything about this, but if it's constantly reported, somebody has to pick it up and do something. And
it's a really good point. And actually, when a lot of housing organisations were going through introducing themselves to the idea that they're going to have to make efficiency savings, the real obvious was, let's actually weed out the stuff that we shouldn't be dealing with, so we do have more time and resources to focus on the stuff that we absolutely should. And I know a lot of housing organisations are really concentrating on that first point of conversation. So the minute that someone rings them up and reports something that in their eyes is ASB, there's actually a real frank conversation around that which manages the expectations. It's far, far worse to open something as a case of ASB because the caller perceives it in that way, get them filling in diary sheets for 6 months and tell them then that there's actually nothing that can be done. It's a difficult conversation at source, but it's the right conversation, and actually it's what needs to happen, and that's happening across housing organisations at the moment, where they're starting to have a lot more honest and open conversations at that beginning conversation.
It actually sounds as though you work for Peabody, because it's exactly what we're going through. And it really is, you're right, having that frank conversation at first contact. and then agreeing an action plan, which is that's a standard practice for us now. So if we say that we're going to monitor it over the next couple of weeks and we're going to ring you up at least once a week to find out how you are and what we've done, that's what we have to do. But it's setting that expectation right from the very beginning, so they don't think we're going to be able to evict somebody straight away. Because a lot of the time, the tenants don't understand the hoops that we have to jump through if we are going to take some enforcement action. They really do not understand that. What they think is that there's no action being taken. We're behind the scenes. The housing officers are trying to do a hell of a lot. And it's that failure of even my staff sometimes to keep that regular contact going. When we actually do a survey at the end of an ASB case to see how satisfied they are with it. And I would say a high percentage of the time it's the failure of my staff to go back as regularly as they said they would do to keep somebody informed of what's actually going on with the case.
Sorry, but just to say, this links into something that's been mentioned a couple of times, which is about the fear factor, which is about actually being scared to go and confront someone's inappropriate behaviour. So actually what's ending up is that housing associations like Peabody are being asked to get involved in situations when really it's about going next door and knocking on the door and saying, I'm really sorry, but actually when you play your noise at 1 o'clock in the morning, I can hear it. I don't know if you know that I can hear it. Do you want to come round into my living room and hear what I'm hearing? But people are too scared to even go and knock on the door of their neighbours because they don't know who those people are.
Yeah, but you know, to address that, we actually have cards that we give people where you can write it in there. Hi, I could hear your music at 1 o'clock. You might not know it, and that's what they're able to put through the door instead of knocking on that door because there is that fear factor.
Brilliant.
Things like that sharing would be a good idea because it saves all the paperwork that goes with all of these issues.
Yeah, but trust me, sometimes it gets put back through the letterbox. And the wording that comes back is not always as polite as what went in the first place.
Well done, I understand, I really understand.
I think I'm being a bit unfair on housing professionals though, because I think that work's always been done. There's always been an expectation management that goes on. But I think the challenge for a lot of housing professionals that are at the sharp end is that it's a resourcing thing again, because if they've got a case that lands on their desk where there's been a stabbing in a tower block, and they've got to go and deal with having a conversation and expectation management about a one-off incident of a loud party, you can see what's going to take priority. And so sometimes there is a risk of those lower level but high impact activities not being addressed because there isn't the time available to that professional to be able to address them in the way that they might like to had they had the ability to.
Yes, so therefore, given that, we have got to look at economies, going forward, I'm just wondering whether a piece of work at some point ought to be done, or how do we educate people in general, not just in housing, in general, as to what the police can do, what the authorities can do going forward, so you don't even have to put things through. People do take responsibility themselves. That's the point.
One thing that is really important to bring it back a little bit to the mental health point is that although you might say, actually, no, we can't deal with that, there's not going to be the evidence or whatever, and then you, at your triage point, you turn it down, that's also where people will come into our services saying, but hang on a minute, my perception is X, and in their reality, their life is still crumbling, and so it's then who do you send those people to? And it's where the mental health is lacking, or where victim support services are lacking, so that person then doesn't get that kind of help. And the other question is, why are we expecting housing officers to go so far out of what should be their remit to deal with everything? They can't do it all. And actually housing officers should be able to, because there have been cuts and they are restricted to do the jobs that they need to do, but to link in with mental health services or victim support services, which I would say again should be commissioned, because people don't have that service in that way. And that's where it has to be joined up. ASB is so complex that you absolutely need both sides together, and each side then can manage expectations for one another.
Right, okay. I want to move on now to the enforcement end of the spectrum. That is really useful, sort of looking at background victims, etc. But I want to talk about the actual enforcement, tackling antisocial behaviour, clearly in the context, as we referred to already, which is the 2014 bill listing a fresh number of powers. One particular I have experience of is the Public Spaces Protection Order. But I think initially, Caroline, you're leading on this.
Yeah. I mean, we've heard, I was going to ask you about some of the key challenges of tackling antisocial behaviour, but you've covered those really, really thoroughly. So what I want to focus on, and maybe I could start with Kuljit, is the issue of the new legislation, which you're obviously an absolute expert in. What impact that is having on tackling antisocial behaviour in London. I think London councils, we'd had some written evidence from, and they had said practitioners like the new powers are willing to use them, especially on new issues, but obviously there may be challenges as well.
So the feedback I've had is that it's a mixed bag across London, and there are some local authorities who will say that the new powers have been really empowering because they're able to take ownership of issues that are tenure neutral and go to social housing, but also private housing, also commercial properties where there is a problem with noise, for example. And so there is a great sense of empowerment. And the other thing I think people have received very well is that in the main, a lot of these powers can be dealt with by housing officers. And so there isn't necessarily a need to take input from lawyers, and of course that's obviously not in my interest, but it means that they feel better equipped to deal with things themselves, having had the training. So to that extent, I think they're being very well used. In terms of the powers specifically, injunctions seem to be working very well. There seem to be a lot of injunctions being sought, and also in relation to breach of injunctions, some of those have led to mandatory possession being sought, and that seems to be a problem-free area. Janine's already picked up on where there is an issue, it seems to me, with injunctions, which is in relation to the positive requirements. And they can be imposed both for injunctions and for criminal behaviour orders. And the principal difficulty there is twofold. One is the lack of services in each area. The other relates to there being people being reluctant to stick their head up as being the person that's the supervisor. And so people don't want to be the one that's responsible for reporting back to the local authority, say, about whether person X has attended their intervention. An example of a positive requirement that some of my clients have found useful, particularly housing associations where they don't have in-house social services and others, is asking the court to order that somebody go and see their GP. And that the GP is the point of access to other referral services. And so what they will do alongside that requirement to see the GP is write to the GP to say, we're dealing with this person for the following reasons. We have these concerns. He's been required to come and see you. Could you please consider what support might be available? But the positive requirements, there has been very limited uptake, and that goes back to trying to deal with the underlying problem, because I think to an extent we're hampered. The problem with criminal behaviour orders, just to flag up, is that there does seem to be a bit of a variation as to whether or not the CPS are prepared to run with an application for a criminal behaviour order, in the same way as we have with the old bolt-on ASBO. So, as you know, criminal behaviour orders are in effect an injunction that can be bolted on to a criminal conviction. And it should be a streamlined process because someone's already in court and you can have an order with certain prohibitions on it. But the uptake has varied, and I think that does come down to the individuals and their willingness to pursue them. CPNs are working very well, particularly community protection notice warning letters, which seem to have very often have the effect that people don't need to then take any further enforcement action because the warning letter of itself is proving to be a good deterrent. And I know in places like Newham, they're into the nearly 3,000 mark when it comes to the warning letters on all sorts of behaviour. And it's been a useful way of dealing with existing behaviours like littering, like untidy front gardens, but also being used for other examples of noise nuisance where maybe they would normally have considered statutory nuisance, but it's not quite severe enough to constitute statutory nuisance. An example might be preachers or somebody chalking on pavements is where CPNs have been used, and we've seen some quite severe fines being imposed in relation to CPN, so again a good deterrent. And I know Paul will be able to tell you about some of the other interesting uses that CPNs have been put to. The challenge with CPNs, and to an extent with all of the powers, is about education and training in how they can be used. And whilst there is the training out there, sometimes it's a resourcing issue in terms of being able to afford the training for one's officers. And so training is one area where we need some better work. The other issue relates to designation of powers, because CPNs can be issued by local authority officers, by the police, and by others that are designated. And so far, there's been some designation, but not very much. And I know housing providers in particular are quite keen to be able to be designated so that they can deal with problems on their own estates. And there's some work to be done around that. Closure orders have proved incredibly effective, and they have been straightforward to obtain, partly because there are now template documents in the book. And so people know that it's filling in a form and a date and it's ready to go. And I think people have found it a very easy to access tool for providing immediate respite to a community. And as you know, you serve your notice and it's a 24 or 48 hour notice, and you get to court within that 48 hours. You can close a property for 3 months, up to 3 months, and then another 3 months. And so it's a very effective way of dealing with a problem quickly, as long as the evidence exists. They've also been used to deal with things like child sexual exploitation, which in terms of the comings and goings from properties, where properties are being used in effect as brothels or as places where sexual exploitation takes place, and young women, it's usually young women, are sometimes being drugged and offered alcohol and then being taken advantage of in these properties. And what the feedback on those is that by issuing a closure order, very often the perpetrators never come back. And so it deals with the problem, and it deals with it on a longer term basis. The real challenge from my point of view has been around public space protection orders, because again it goes back to the lack of consistency in information sharing, in that some boroughs have decided that they're going to include prohibitions that cover various behaviours, and so we have seen PSPOs deal with legal highs, deal with access to tower blocks, deal with cycling, touting, and Cambridge have done a touting PSPO, aggressive begging and dog control. There's a huge range of areas that can be covered by a PSPO. And there are two problem areas that have come across my desk. One relates to the fact that at present there is no guidance as to which level the PSPO should be implemented by in terms of a local authority, and only a local authority has got that power. So in some areas you've seen a single officer implement a PSPO, in others it's gone to cabinet and full council. And so whilst there's a consultation process, the scrutiny that's needed in relation to PSPOs and their terms hasn't really been there, and that it has in part led to criticism by groups such as Liberty and the Manifesto Club. And we have had some absurd orders being made, and examples are bans on lying down in public. And the idea is to deal with rough sleeping, but what it's affected is the person who wants to have a sunbathe in a local park on a Saturday afternoon. Bans on wearing hats, because it's about dealing with the problem of young people disguising themselves when they're going in to thieve, but it's a blanket ban on hats. And the reason those things have happened is because there is these are real life examples, and I can give you the authorities involved. I probably don't want to name them in this forum, but I can certainly give you those details where there's not been the scrutiny, and so the lead to sense check something has been missing. That's one big area in terms of the level at which those orders go into place. The other area where I've seen a problem is in relation to evidence base and consultation, because authorities haven't necessarily had the evidence base available to them to put in place the order that they want. And it's partly about political motivation. And an example is Newcastle at the moment has recently put in place a public space protection order where they're looking at dealing with chugging or charity mugging, so the charity collectors. Yeah. And they had to look very closely. Their first PSPO had to be pulled because there were issues around the lack of evidence to suggest that it ought to be an area-wide order. And really there were a few streets affected, and identifying those streets and it being a much more tailored approach, which is what the legislation suggests. So there is a real problem around ensuring that people have the right evidence base to put in place the order that they're seeking to put in. Swindon is another example where they consulted on 5 prohibitions, and just before the PSPO was going to be put into place added a 6th, which hadn't been subject to any consultation. So there are examples where there hasn't been a sense check, and so as I say, the level at which these things are done, and also the evidence-based and consultation process around it. And I think some authorities have thought that the consultation is the evidence gathering, when of course it's not. The evidence gathering ought to have been done, and then you consult on what your proposals for dealing with those problems are. And I think there's been a perception that one deals with them as part of the consultation, which isn't the intention. So again, there's been criticism from various bodies, and I know the government is committed to issuing some new guidance on all the tools and powers. And I understand that there will be some additional guidance in relation to how public space protection orders ought to be used. But that's the one power where I think there is some work to be done.
May I just say, the flip side, I have some experience of almost a reticence to introduce them or consider them because of some of the reasons and complexities that you've mentioned. And because of that reticence, in the past, you could have put, for example, drinking bans and dispersal orders fall underneath those, and they would have been perhaps quite swift to implement in themselves. But because of the complexities we just talked about, the PSPOs, some authorities may be more troubled in introducing them. I think we also we've got quite a few questions left, so we're going to need to pick up the pace. Sean, did you want to come back on that before Caroline comes in?
Yes.
Quickly.
Just very, very quickly on sort of free speech protests, that kind of behaviour, which is obviously something that I think some of these powers are being used against. I wondered if you had any examples. I know the case of Heathrow protesters, they did seek to bring criminal behaviour orders against them, the CPS. I think some of the public space protection orders about gathering in certain groups are to do with protesting more than they are to do with actual antisocial behaviour. Have you got examples of that you've seen?
Not that I've seen, and there is inbuilt protection within the legislation because the local authorities are required to have regard to the rights of freedom of assembly and freedom of expression when putting in place a public space protection order, for example. And it goes back to the point about scrutiny, because if a single officer is dealing with these things, you have to ask whether there's the adequate level of scrutiny to be able to ensure that those matters have been properly factored in. But I have to say there aren't really, they're not problematic from that point of view, although the Manifesto Club might have something different to say on that. And they've done 2 reports which you might find interesting reading in relation to who's done what and the prohibitions that have been introduced by each area.
Just PSPOs you're talking about there?
That's just PSPOs.
Also things like dispersal orders, criminal behaviour orders, those kinds of things.
I've not had any issues that I've had to deal with, but that might be because I am at one end of the spectrum in terms of enforcement. There might be others that have a contribution on that.
Caroline, sorry.
Yeah, I wanted to just continue just a little bit further, perhaps with Kuljit, and then I'll bring in others in terms of other measures in the Act where they're giving communities and victims a say. And so the community trigger and the community remedy. I was just wondering if you've got any feedback on how they're working, and then I'll come to others quickly.
I have, to the extent that I would have expected there to be more calls for some legal advice on things such as the policies and procedures around the community trigger, and I've done some work on the community trigger, but my perspective is that there's very little use of it. There's very little knowledge about it, and local authorities in particular, but bodies generally, it's not in their interest to publicise the existence of it. And so I think it's, in theory, it sounded like a really useful way of empowering victims, but I don't think it's had that outcome.
Anyone else want to comment on
can
this?
I just basically echo that same view? I mean, there is, one of the frustrations I have is in the legislation there is a statutory obligation for areas to publish how many community trigger applications they've had, how many have met the threshold, how many of those recommendations have been made. And actually, I don't think most areas are meeting that statutory obligation. Now, there is a Home Office ASB forum which we sit on, which was designed to monitor the implementation of the tools. And that's one of the questions we keep saying, who is holding these areas to account for what is already a statutory obligation? And it's just there isn't an answer to that at the moment. And that feeds into a bigger problem about all of this. Your question to us is, how well are the new tools and powers working? We can give you anecdotal information, but actually there is nowhere that says there's been this many injunctions and this many have been breached, this many CBOs and this many have been breached. So actually, if you think back to the white paper of 2012, Putting Victims First, which listed a number of objectives of the Act, make it quicker, put victims first, make it easier, we don't actually know whether those objectives have really been met because we don't have any central source of information.
Paul, did you want to add something?
Caroline, you're absolutely right. The statutory guidance is all about victims and communities. It's putting that back. The community remedy is not used in London. I think very few local authorities use it. And there's supposed to be a drop-down menu of things that the victim can suggest in relation to what the perpetrator may have to do. I think the only one in London is apologise, and it's very rarely used. So the community remedy is not a power that's used in London, and that's something we could look at and explore why that is. The community trigger, I had the first one in London, funny enough, which was 2 minutes after midnight on the 20th of October 2014, and it was a lawyer from Channel 4 News. And actually, I thought, first of all, it was just a tester, but it turned out to be one of the worst cases I've ever dealt with, and it took me a long time to actually get to a satisfactory conclusion. But the one thing I would say with the community trigger is it's a lost opportunity. I think practitioners and certainly local authorities, police, don't understand the benefits that a community trigger can bring, because what it does, it scrutinises the way the partnership has dealt with a problem and looks at the sort of strengths and weaknesses in relation to that approach. It's not a complaints mechanism, and I think it's still being thought of by lots of people around the country. It's best not to tell the public about this because we're going to be inundated with complaints. The pilots didn't, even Manchester had to go out and find people to complain, and that tells you in relation to why the community trigger, how that was received there. But I find the community trigger is a fantastic opportunity for local politicians, for other organisations where they're not getting mental health and safeguarding teams, etc., or social care or police or whoever round the table to deal with their particular problems, because it highlights it. And the reason why I want to emphasise this, and we really need to sort of start looking at the community trigger as a way forward in London, is that we talked about information sharing. Now, information sharing for antisocial behaviour across the partnerships is under the Crime and Disorder Act, what they call Section 115. The difference is with the community trigger, people have to share information, where under Section 115 they should share information. And what that does is it gets all the paperwork on the table, and it's sort of obvious where the issues are and where the weaknesses are. It benefits the partnerships to use it more.
Brilliant. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Tom?
Yes, I'm going to move on to look at how, I suppose, how we measure success, really. So how is the effectiveness of the use of these tools and powers to deal with antisocial behaviour measured? Can I start with Paul?
Well, I think there's a danger that we go back to the days of Together campaign, where the boroughs that used ASBOs more than anybody else were deemed to be more successful than anybody else. I think the whole point of this is the public don't care what you use, they just want the problems to stop. Now, sometimes that's realistic and sometimes it's not realistic, and I think it's really down to sort of public satisfaction surveys in relation to how we're seen to be working in partnership to tackle some of their local priorities. I think there's a lot of responsibility placed on the communities themselves. I think they could be more empowered through neighbourhood agreements to sort of draw up things like, community rules. You have a moped, fine, you can keep it on the estate, but you don't ride it after 8 o'clock around the estate, because we as an estate have deemed that to be antisocial. And I think we haven't gone back to the community to actually identify what success looks like to them. And I think if we deem what success looks like, we're going to set ourselves up to fail from the start.
Okay, so we ask people how they would view success. Okay, Janine?
I'm not going to touch on Joe's toes because I imagine he's going to talk a lot about housing. It would just be me repeating the point about the fact that I think it's a real gap that we're not monitoring the use of the tools and powers to see how effective they really are.
Okay. Joe?
I mean, to be honest, at Peabody we measure it in two ways. One will be year on year, looking at the boroughs, the reports of ASB and the type of ASB getting in there, and what I'm looking for is a reduction year on year. The other one is, I think I mentioned it earlier, we survey everybody when we close a case to see how satisfied they were. Over the past few years, we have been struggling, because if there are other RPs sitting around the table, they'll say there's a difference if you use a third party to do the satisfaction surveys or whether you do them in-house. As soon as we went outside, our satisfaction levels dropped completely. Even when we changed the question slightly, it still didn't have a big impact. We've just merged with another organisation that do their satisfaction surveys in-house, and their satisfaction levels are much higher than ours. Now, we only merged officially this week, so I'm yet to see which family mosaic. Yeah. So we're about to see which way we're going to go. But it really is talking to the individual to see how satisfied they actually were. And I mentioned it earlier.
I just don't understand. So you're saying that it makes a difference whether or not it
actually does.
But why is that? Do you know?
Some of it is because when my staff are actually doing the calls to the residents, see how they were, we're actually having a more in-depth conversation with them to find out why they may not be satisfied. Because when you use a third party, they ask that one question, get the result, and then move on to the next one.
It's very superficial, is it?
It is. Yeah. It is very superficial.
Okay, yep.
I would say the really important things here are two. One, is the ASB decreasing and is the impact decreasing? And then looking at how people are getting on with their lives. And I think that a standard measure does not exist. We don't, across the organisations, have standard risk measures. We don't have standard vulnerability measures, and we don't have standard definitions. We also don't have standard ways of capturing that picture of what's going on. So we don't, as organisations, either know when we send a case from one to the other, has it worked? Is that person's life getting better? There's a kind of tendency to refer over there and tick a box and get a satisfaction survey potentially on what you've done. But none of these things, satisfaction, all this kind of stuff, doesn't actually ask the question of, did we help you? Is it working? Has the ASB stopped? And are you able to now cope with your life? Because we also take a lot of clients who are coming to us after an ASB event may have stopped, but they might still be impacted. They might still be hypervigilant. They might still be struggling because they've been out of work for a long time. Their finances might have been impacted. Their housing situation may be unstable. So our role then is to come in and, in the same way we work with victims of crime, helping them to cope and recover from that. And so it's actually how is somebody able to move on with their life so they're not going to be vulnerable to repeat incidents later on, so that they're not going to go on to perpetrate. So I think it's about standardising those measures across the sector.
I mean, in terms of the data we've got, we've talked about satisfaction surveys and things like that. Is there any other data out there that can help us shape the response to antisocial behaviour?
I think it's something that needs to be developed together. So each of us have our own tools. We survey people when they come in and midpoint, and then nearer the end of the work we do with them, we ask them about how often the incidents are happening, how severe those incidents are. We ask them about their mental health. We ask them about their family, their social networks, and all the areas of their life that might have been impacted. And we then follow them through the journey that they have with us. And while we engage with other agencies as well, but that's a victim support measure. That's not something that translates then into, for example, if we had a client that was also with Peabody, so we can't actually track that together. We don't know how our interventions work, and we can't say across the board if someone's satisfied. If you report something to the Met, you might know that cases are dropping down, but you have no idea if they were resolved. Are they individual? Are they isolated incidents? Are they part of the same picture? Have people not been reporting? I think one of the key things out of this is we just don't know a lot of the information. We don't have that basic infrastructure to work together, to share information and to collect data. And without that, a lot of it is anecdotal and it's guesswork, and it's what we know for each of our organisations.
Is that sometimes inevitable with different organisations, or is it something that can be changed and you can get a standard sort of metric?
I think for me, ASB it's where safeguarding was, it's where domestic abuse was. It's a group of victims who are some of the most vulnerable people in our city, who are not classified as victims of crime, so they're not eligible for support. They're under the radar. When things happen, when people's mental health deteriorate, when they go into crisis, when they commit suicide, is not associated with antisocial behaviour, because we don't know and we can't say. But I would suggest that in certain cases it is. We're not joined up because we don't have to be. But in safeguarding children and adults, and in domestic abuse, we've had all of the legislation put in. We've had the structures put in. We have merits consistently. We have risk assessment tools that are standard across the sector. You have Safe Lives and DV who coordinate a lot of that work, and that is just missing here because people are not seeing it as a priority or recognising that we're talking about really vulnerable victims. I think, and it comes back to this thing that it's so broad. You think about a group of children on the street corner or dog fouling or some of those things, and you don't see the victims. The victims are hidden, but in a lot of antisocial behaviour, it's very hidden, very vulnerable people who are engaged in conflict in their immediate environment. So their home isn't even a safe place. Their local community isn't a safe place. They have no let-up, no gap to actually have that bit of peace. And then the agencies aren't even working together. No one's listening to them or taking them seriously. So these people feel completely failed at every single level, and they have nowhere to go.
Okay, I'll move on. Continue with the next question, which is I'll start with you, Molly. How successful do you think the work to address antisocial behaviour in London has been?
I think it's all about pockets. Everyone here on this board has done some amazing work, and there are other people, other professionals that aren't here today that will join up and do really forward-thinking, really clever, connected work. And the ASB sector is a really passionate one. You'll find people that have been working in it, as Paul has, for many, many years, and so you have got that continuity of knowledge, and then people who are younger coming in can pick that up. But what you don't have is any standards at all, and that's the problem. And so it doesn't matter if there's a really great piece of work going on in one borough or another borough, we don't join it up. So one of the things we started to do in victim support is we recognise that actually we work in a number of boroughs, and our community safety teams don't know what goes on in their neighbouring borough. So we started to build in and are looking more at building in dialogues. How can we, on the ground, actually start to connect these ideas together? But fundamentally, you need to have somewhere at the top that filters down and pulls everyone together and has standards and consistency and brings in that practice, because otherwise it'll always get lost, because it's based on passionate individuals rather than something that's, you know, an equal standard for every victim of ASB.
Is there scope for the mayor to be someone who can pull these strands together?
But you have this fundamental problem, which is that antisocial behaviours...
Sorry, I'm going on to Umesh's question. I'm terribly sorry.
Okay.
We'll come back to that. We'll come back to that. If I could put the same question about success and whether and what has been successful in terms of tackling antisocial behaviour in London to David.
Well, I'm listening with great interest to my colleagues here, because as identified, measurement is very difficult. It is anecdotal. The information that comes back to me says that the systems are working, that we have the right partnerships in place, that we are achieving outcomes. But it is verbal, it is anecdotal, and it's very hard to put fixed measurement against it. The point about standards and looking at in the wider aspect, I totally endorse. I mean, I think there's a huge way to go, and I think we're tracking towards who might pick this up and where it might head. So I'd have to say, from my point of view, it's an area which needs much more work on.
Okay. Any other thoughts? I know we're sort of running, the time is running out, but...
2011, I was seconded from the Met to Government Office for London. My responsibility was to go to all London boroughs and get them to do a self-assessment of how they tackled antisocial behaviour, how they trained people, how they shared information, how they had a lead person that was responsible, how they had a strategic partnership, how they had a case management system, whatever the questions were. And they were all issued with that specific questionnaire. They were visited by a group of expert practitioners, and then they were asked to do a development plan in how they were going to take forward the antisocial behaviour agenda. And out of that came a multitude of good practice, sharing of information, the need for a central sort of coordination. And I think what we're finding now with London is that we had people like community safety managers who were the sole person to go to really coordinate this, but they're becoming very strategic and not as operational maybe as they were in the past. And I think we're losing a lot of the expertise. I think we're losing a lot of the expert practitioners that we've had in London over the number of years for one reason or another. But I think the lessons that came out of that was that the police can't be the only organisation to deal with ASB, and I think some London boroughs are now relying on the police to be the only organisation to deal with ASB, apart from local housing providers, etc. I think the other thing is that we've lost the opportunity because we've lost by the wayside. I used to help an organisation called the London Action Trust, who used to commission voluntary sector organisations to get involved in the antisocial behaviour agenda. And what was interesting when that happened was that the successes in London came from not the statutory organisations, although the enforcement was really important, but from all the voluntary sector that started to feel that they were an equal partner in working on community problems. And again, I emphasise the fact that Charlton Athletic, the Kicks project came out of that. The Fire Brigade came up with a life scheme from Tower Hamlets. That went global. It's gone to different countries. And we had responsible retailers agreements that I did with Keep Britain Tidy. That was seen as good practice. ABCs went global as well. So we've had such good practice in this city. A lot of the other areas of the country look at London as the lead area for tackling ASB. And I think we've lost that. And that's not undermining Manchester and other big cities, but I think we've lost that sort of credibility because there's no coordination now. And we don't even know what our neighbouring boroughs are doing rather than what's happening around the country.
So quite clear from what everyone said, we need a lot more joining up.
Can I just make a contribution? Yep. And that's that I know we've talked a lot about data sharing and information sharing, and we just don't know what's going on. I think this committee has to be very careful not to think that outcomes are just about statistics. Because as Paul and Janine have already mentioned, that just because you've got 20 ASBOs does not mean that you are successful at tackling antisocial behaviour in your area. And unfortunately, that is the tone that the government's white paper took, is that, well, look at all these areas that have done all this. Actually, it's not about that. It's about measuring the impact on victims when you start an intervention and when you end an intervention. And
Which,
that's
of course,
the
is
measure
much more
of
difficult
success.
than just counting ASBOs. Yeah.
But that leads to my second point about, well, what do you do? Because I think it's absolutely about giving ownership to local areas. And Paul's point about the local surveys within local authorities and local authorities being charged with that is really important. And then what you need on top of that is a coordination, a single point of coordination. And a bit like the Mayor's got his nighttime economies are, perhaps you need an antisocial behaviours are. And I'd be as bold as to suggest that someone like Paul would be the sort of, that's the kind of person you need who's got that longevity.
It is building for the moment, possibly.
Well,
There's a good,
whatever
there's
you
a point
call
well
it,
made.
labels.
Somebody to pull it together.
To pull it together and take a lead.
I think we're going back onto Umesh's question, so I'll
Let's
stop there.
No, let's not stop there, because
So
I think he's going to finish off on the mayoral aspect. So we're moving into giving communities and victims a say. We've already covered, I believe, the community trigger.
I apologise, Andrew. I took some of his question without realising it. I'm so sorry. No, it's
Andrew's
fine.
always relaxed about that sort of thing, aren't you, Andrew?
Should have
Not
been
a problem.
picked up. So
Right,
sorry.
all yours.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, a lot of things I was going to raise have actually been dealt with, and it doesn't really matter, as long as it's dealt with. But perhaps I can ask sort of an overarching question. I mean, the purpose of the 2014 Act is to put victims at the heart of what's going on. Has that actually happened, Holly?
I think it's probably like with everything else. In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. I think that I've seen certainly some really good examples of it. I think in other cases, sometimes victims do get sidelined. So the community trigger, for example, it can work really well. It can be undermined when you have the same people who are carrying out the investigation into what had happened as were kind of responsible for the work. So there can be an issue with that. But in general, where someone's reviewing the case, it's good, but victims don't know it's available. It's like all these other things. Do victims really know what their rights are? And I would say the answer to that is no. And then in terms of some of the agreements that can be made between individuals or to prevent harmful behaviour, does the victim really understand what that thing's trying to do and what the consequences are? We certainly have some cases where individuals are almost self-regulating and self-policing the tools that were put in their name. And so I asked some people in my team last week, have you got any examples you'd like to raise? And somebody said that there was a lady that had spent, over a year keeping a diary on somebody who had I think it was a PCM put against them to try and prove that thing was being breached. So I think you can always find the good and the bad, but I think it comes back to victims need to understand their rights and they need to be able to access them better. That information needs to be more out there for people.
I think if I can answer that question quite frankly, I don't think much has changed. So I think if you were very good at putting victims at the centre, you're still doing that. If you were very bad, you're probably still doing that. With the two main things in the Act that were supposed to be about giving communities a voice, the trigger and the remedy, we've heard from Paul that the remedy isn't being used in London. We've heard from everybody on the panel, and it's replicated across the country, because I can vouch for that the community trigger is being adopted. On one, I can count on one hand how many applications are being made. So actually, I really don't think that the ASB Act has made much difference in terms of whether the victims are the focus or not.
There's a couple of good bits of practice, though. I just must mention, I've worked for the two London councils, Ealing and Kensington and Chelsea, and we successfully bid for MOPAT money to put a victim support manager in the community safety team. And the purpose of that individual was not to get involved in casework, but to ensure that the victim remained at the centre of all focused investigations. And it's really interesting when you actually take the victim out, how quickly you forget about the victim and concentrate on the perpetrator. And the sole purpose of that individual was to pull it back into the impact on the victim. The second thing was we got funding at both those London boroughs as well to get a mental health manager to work in community safety as well. And their job was not to deal with mental health cases or to take responsibility for that, was to educate us as practitioners how to get our foot in the door with the mental health services. What did the Adult Safeguarding Board look like, or the Safeguarding Children's Board? What did the MASH mean? What did they discuss? What was the thresholds? What does this terminology mean that they're going to bamboozle us so that we walk away thinking, I think we've still got the problem? And that was really useful to us, because it educated and skilled up the team to know not only from their perspective, but with the partnership was able to come in and get advice in relation to that as well.
we talked about the community trigger and all that sort of thing. I was going to ask Joe this. I mean, irrespective of the community trigger and those things being known about or not known about, I mean, to what extent the communities actually do get involved in trying to address antisocial behaviour in a more general way?
You mean without coming to us and them doing it by themselves?
Well, no, I mean, listen, I don't mean vigilantism.
Yes.
That sometimes happens, I guess.
Yes.
I'm more concerned about the extent to which people collectively bring these issues forward.
Right. I'm just really going to say what everyone else has said. The community trigger just hasn't worked for us in any kind of way. So we've now, because of the pilot that we're doing, we've introduced our own kind of community trigger now. So when we get multiple reports of one particular issue, we'll actually pick it up as ASB. So even if one case wasn't going to be treated as ASB, when we start getting them as multiples, we'll then pick that up and treat it as an ASB case. When it comes to making it victim focused, I'd love to sit here and say to you, we're great at it. We don't have the time a lot of the time to actually be great at it. We'll make that statement, I'm going to be honest, we'll make that statement and we will try. But when you've got housing officers that are dealing with multiple cases, what they really want to do is deal with that case as quickly as they can, because they've got to move on to the next one. And that's when it will slip through. And if you've got someone who's got mental health issues, really, they're focused on dealing with the ASB, and if they can do, they will try and refer it out, or we're lucky enough that we've got our tenant and family support team that they might refer them to, but then that's the end of it for the housing officer, because they're moving on to the next ASB case. It's the resources out there, they're just not great enough for us to deal with every single case as an individual and do really great justice for it. So we've still got a lot of work to do if we're going to focus on the victim itself. And that's
just going to say that as well, in addition to that, I think there's a responsibility in the organisations to go out there and find out who's out there to help them with their problems. I think we do it through crisis management. So we do it at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon when that case comes in, and we then contact around to find out who's going to be able to help us. And I do quite a lot of training on safeguarding antisocial behaviour, and one of the things I ask them is who have you gone out there to find and to link in with and build bridges and relationships with, so when you do have that case which is a little bit more complicated, there's complex issues in relation to it, you've already got the people at the end of the phone to give you advice, and no one's done that. So I think there is a responsibility on some organisations that they need to find out who actually is in their local partnerships. And I think, again, we've gone back into isolated ways of working. We've worked, so how does our organisation deal with the risk? And once you start looking at one organisation managing risk, then you're setting yourself up for major problems. Risk can only be managed through partnership working. I've never seen a case that can't.
Can I ask you then, in that context, about resources? Is this a money thing or an organisational thing? Because I think one of you, maybe you, Paul, said earlier on, if you get involved earlier, it works out, you can deal with the problem much easier and, I suppose, effectively, therefore, cheaper. Yeah. So is it a chicken and the egg? I mean, in the end, if you get it right with the proper partnership working, does it mean you can actually cope within the existing resources, or does it become, of course, resource intensive because you're not doing that partnership work sufficiently early?
That's a really good question. I think it's a multitude of all those things. I think it's priorities. Not every organisation has the same priority and strategy as everybody else, so they're not going to work unless it actually fulfills their priorities. That's a major issue. But also I think that I think as we change, ASB has kind of become mainstream, where I think in the past it was quite specialist, and those of us that have been in it for a long time have seen complete changes throughout the process. We've become very good at it, and I think the gang problem has benefited hugely from the ASB agenda, the community engagement, information sharing, the problem solving, the tools and powers, etc. And if you look at the gang agenda at the moment, they're using antisocial behaviour tools and powers now. They're not using gang injunctions as much as they used to. So they're kind of learning from this agenda as it's built up. But I think also, a lot of people don't see ASB as a particular problem anymore, and it's kind of taken a back seat. So you've got ASB where in the past the community safety team, the ASB operational team came under one particular department. It's now split up. It's very strategic. It's about writing strategies and documents and brochures. It's not about actually going out there and doing the job. And I think we've lost that ability and we've lost those skills. And I really honestly think that antisocial behaviour is really effectively dealt with by two organisations in London, and that is mainly the police and housing providers who see it as an everyday responsibility, and I think the councils see it as a responsibility when it needs to be a responsibility. And I feel very sorry for the people that work many years in council ASB teams, because I think they're struggling every year to for existence, and also for extra funding to actually improve the quality of service that they provide.
I would endorse that, and I think hearing feedback from our team, it was encapsulated by the quote that they have the resource and the working methodologies and the partnerships to be actually quite good at being reactive, but they don't have anything to help them being proactive. And I think that's the difference, is that they can hold their head above water, but they actually can't take that next step forward and to be proactive, to preempt problems and start to work to the future. So head above water, but would like to take it further.
And actually, what we were talking about as one of the positive solutions to this, which is actually to manage your resource, you screen out the low-level stuff and you deal with what we define as ASB. What you've just screened out is the prevention section. And so it is money, because it's about the fact that we've got mental health under-resourced, which is not to do with this group, but that's still an important factor. And so then people come over here. So it's definitely about having more resource to do what people do well, but then to do that, to add on the special bit, the stuff that keeps someone in the longer term and that picks someone up before it's got into crisis.
I'd say one of the issues that you will have is the way that, as housing providers, we actually measure success. It's already been mentioned about Housemark. So in Housemark, you do put in there about your level of satisfaction, but the other key one is how much is it costing you to manage that particular bit of the service. The more money you're spending on it, the less successful you actually are as an organisation. It's almost a race to the bottom.
Do you know what I'd like?
So if I've got high satisfaction and low cost, every RP is going to you to ask, how are you managing to actually do that? And it's only when you start drilling down, you suddenly find out actually there's no longer a specialist ASB team. That might be work that's spread out amongst your housing officers. And when your housing officers are, let's say, generic, there are bits of the job that they like to do, bits they don't like to do. The ones that they can deal with really quickly, they'll deal with that. And ASB, especially if there's mental health issues or other impact, it will get pushed back until they can find the time to do it. Finding the time to do it, it may never actually happen.
So you're saying you get high satisfaction rate with low input?
I'm saying if you can achieve that. So if you can achieve high satisfaction and it costs you a lot less money to do it, then you're being seen as a good...
You're the go-to guy for that, not you necessarily. Well, did you want to...
Is that pie in the sky?
It's my aspiration. And I've been trying to get there for a long time.
Well done.
I think Joe's point is about measuring success, and that you just have to be mindful about how, if you're going out to other people to get evidence about whether or not they're successful in dealing with ASB, it's about how they define that success, and just looking closely at that.
Yeah. I mean, the real problem is ASB on the receiving end of the witness is very subjective, whereas bureaucracies always like objective measurement.
Without a doubt.
Just to come back to you, Mr. Dunn, the point you made about councils, if I heard and understood you correctly, then I take a different perspective. Certainly the councils in East London, the area that I represent on the Assembly, Newham, Tower Hamlets, Barking, Dagenham, if anything, are putting more resources into enforcement, buying more Section 92 officers. The problem I've found, and surveys have proved this, is more the police culture that actually does not see ASB as a crime. It's not glamorous. It's low down the list of priorities. And that's the problem I see with the Mayor's police and crime plan, which we'll come to in a minute, that it's all very well putting this ASB into the plan. But how do you change that police culture? Now, in Newham, recently the police and council, the conference where they brought all the enforcement officers together, all the ward-based officers, to see how they can work jointly. Now, I see that as an example of actually breaking down that cultural prejudice. But if anything, I think it's the other way around. So,
maybe I was being too general by saying all councils. I
don't know the pictures in other parts of London.
Yeah, I mean, you've mentioned boroughs there. One I've been just working in for the last 8 months, but Newham has notoriously been renowned for good enforcement action in relation to ASB from a council perspective, enforcement office.
Until last year, I was a cabinet member in charge of crime and enforcement in Newham.
There we are. I think that's, I mean, we're almost going to pick up some questions at the end in a minute, but I think your point is a good one about ASB and performance and priorities, because now it's now, as Ilmesh mentioned, it's already in the police and crime plan. The Mayor said all the boroughs have taken up ASB as one of their 2 priorities. The job of this committee will be now, in a very public manner is to hold the mayor and those boroughs to account, because they can't, there's no hiding place now, because they've actually put that as their priorities, the mayor has, and that's a kind of good thing. Which moves us on to the last set of questions on this, if you want to just continue.
Sure, yeah. Although there is the issue of the police culture, if you want to come back to that. But it's really about what the mayor can do. The mayor has made ASP, quite rightly, a local priority in every borough. How, and this question is to all of you, how do you think this will strengthen our local responses to ASP? And what more can the mayor do in this area?
Okay, well, first of all, you mentioned there's lots of police contracted teams now working in antisocial behaviour. I mean, some of the boroughs had big teams. Kensington and Chelsea have 40 police officers dealing with antisocial behaviour. I think the same in Tower Hamlets. It's now been reduced, but they're looking at increasing it. Also, some of the housing providers are contracting police teams to deal with local ASB as well. So I think it's a good time. I think there's a bit of a, going to be an explosion of interest in antisocial behaviour across London as well. But I do think it's going back to what I said before about sharing good practice across London. There's an awful lot of boroughs that just deal with it, get on with it, and don't shout about it. And I think we lose opportunities there, and we look at sometimes there's some key boroughs that are seen as the champion boroughs in relation to tackling antisocial behaviour for the right and wrong reasons. And I think there's some really creative work. So the one thing I think the mayor, I'd like to see some coordination of good practice across London, some sharing of good practice, some expertise to boroughs that are struggling a little bit. I think the performance measurement needs to be really ironed out. We need to get that right, because we could cause more problems down the line if we get that wrong. And I emphasised before, one of my jobs was phoning the boroughs up to find out how many tools and powers they used. And I can tell you now, the same boroughs used to phone me up saying, who's on the bottom at such and such? Well, we've done one more than them. And I think there's a danger that we actually we have a false picture in relation to that. But I do think there's case management systems coming to London, which I think will be really useful for the future for managing that risk, sharing information, but more importantly, cross-borough related issues. And we've talked about the fact that lots of boroughs are really not that interested in what happens outside of their borough. But I think that's changing. There's a lot more happening now where people are coming into boroughs causing specific issues. I think the community Marrick's really exciting. As I said before, we've got some really good practice going on there. The College of Policing are doing an evaluation of the Brent version, which is funded now by the Mayor's Office. I believe it was funded initially by Public Health. So that was an inroad for them to come into the ASB agenda, and there's been some real spin-offs in relation to that. They're getting referrals now for GPs into their group of problem solvers. So there's a lot of good practice, and I think it just needs coordination. But I do go back to the fact that what was really useful in 2011 was when every borough was approached with a set of questions, consistent questions, and it kind of told you who was doing what, how they were doing it, and who was effective in prioritising ASB rather than actually dealing with it. And I think that's your starter. Who's prioritising it? Who's getting it right? Who's looking at the future? How we're going to invest in it?
I'm not going to, I mean, we've talked for, over 2 hours, and people have been scribbling away, so I've no doubt you've picked out the things that are really of a key concern to us and where we might get some help from the Mayor's Office. The one thing that I just want to say, however, is that I think there is an element of danger of boxing ASB off. So you have a box for ASB, you have a box for CSE, you have a box for modern slavery, you have a box for domestic abuse. And actually what we forget is that sometimes ASB can be the beginning of a journey that goes on to things like serious organised crime or terrorism. And the other thing that we also forget is that our residents who are reporting things to us might be reporting noise going on next door, which to them is ASB, but actually could be a sign of something a lot more serious. And I think some of these agendas just need to be tied together a little bit, because I think there's a real danger in separating some of them off.
Yeah.
Housing providers have some really good intelligence, because if Paul is my neighbour and is being really noisy, I'm not going to report that to anyone other than my housing provider, but actually that noise might represent a really serious criminal issue, and I just think we have to be careful about how we separate some of these things.
I would a number of points. Just going back actually to an early question that Susan asked when we were talking about data, and I realise that data can be an evil, but let's think of it as a power for good. And you asked where or who should be the coordinator of bringing the various data sources together to give us this better picture, if you like, on ASB. The word MOPAC, I think, was hanging there, but never actually fully got mentioned. And personally, I can't see another body other than MOPAC to who is best placed to actually go back to, Paul, I was just interested in some of your comments about the 2011. I mean, I think this is an exercise which is so, you know, you go on through the summer, Steve, that you'll find that we can start to hone down efficient ways of actually getting that information inputted to you. So I think there's an opportunity there. Switching on a little bit to what else the Mayor, you were saying, can do. I think the step to put the 2 dedicated ward officers in place is an important one and a good one. And I'm encouraged, and again, I don't want to be waving Hammersmith Fulham flag, and I hope this is met wide, but certainly it's not a box-ticking exercise to say we fill those 2 roles, that actually those roles are going to be looked within the police circles to be given encouragement and support and a better recognition of what those community-based roles can do. And I think that's an opportunity to get good quality of policing on the ground, working with the community at that level and being able to involve themselves with ASB. So I'm encouraged by that.
I would say, again, this is squarely with MOPAC, and there's just been a new Victims Commissioner appointed, and I think it's an amazing opportunity for her maybe to take this on board as part of her new role. But I would just put this word of caution, which is that actually, at the minute, victims of ASB are still second rate to victims of crime. They don't have rights, they don't have commissioned services, and we've heard today how important it is to involve victims. We've heard today how vulnerable they are and what the impact is, and we've also heard today that these other organisations do not have the resource to deal with them in a way that would really meet their needs. And so I just would urge any decision on the committee to propose that there could be that equal status and services commissioned specifically for them in the same way as if it was classified crime or ASB, which was ultimately a definition that was decided. That's not down to the individual.
I'm going to be quite boring. Data for me is everything. Everything that I tackle in housing, I need data to be given to me by my staff. The problem that we've got with ASB is that I could have all the data that I like, and it looks as though I'm dealing with it, but unless I'm sharing it with people going across there, it's London-wide, it's not going to help. I can deal with my ASB problems and push them onto another estate, another landlord or the local authority, and that doesn't help London, it just helps Peabody, and we want everybody in London to be safe. So I would go for sharing data, but I've been here before when we've tried to share data. Oh, wow. Even internally, I struggle to share data without trying to share it outside.
For me, I think I agree with everything that's been said, and there are 2 points that I'd draw out. One is in relation to data and information sharing, is that there is a broader way that one can look at things, in that how can we facilitate data sharing, and things like IT systems and common IT systems could be one of the things that come out of this in terms of a recommendation, because it's looking at the broader picture. And the second point is connected to that broader picture, because it isn't just about antisocial behaviour, as Janine has said, but it's also about things like subletting it. It's about Airbnb. It is about what else is going on within our communities, and we've just got to be very careful that we don't exclude consideration of how those other issues can impact. I think we've made those points in your life to them. In terms of the solution, I've already said I think there needs to be some coordination. It seems to be that's the view coming from this side of the room generally.
Did you have another unanswered question?
Well, just to reflect something that I don't think has been touched upon at all during this session. And there's a particular challenge challenges posed by the growing nighttime economy of London. I'm reminded because we've got the chair of the Spitalfields Forum in the gallery, and they hosted a public meeting on the nighttime economy with Amy Lammy and the Mayor of Tower Hamlets. And we've seen, but understandably, ASB within the context of housing and in terms of housing estates and so on, but the particular challenges with the growing economy, the expansion of the night tube and so on. I mean, at one stage it was central London we were talking about. Now we've got Stratford, Brick Lane. I mean, Brick Lane's just changed amazingly from over the years. Croydon, I mean, are there any thoughts? We're talking about the same issues, but these are new challenges. Any thoughts that any of you have in terms of what can we do in terms of legislation, putting more onus on club owners and so on? the people at the public being there attended, they're not NIMBYs, they're not against the nighttime economy. But what was not being addressed was the issues of people urinating on their doorsteps, the noise, people crowding, blocking the pavements.
From my perspective, the ASB agenda covers everything. It doesn't
It
just
does,
cover...
but there are particular challenges.
And, you know, the use of, and the use of CPNs have very effectively been used in Westminster to deal with nighttime economy issues, begging as well, but in an appropriate, proportionate way, and that's really important. So it's gone through a consultation, so it's the right people have been involved in that process. The nighttime economy is really important because it's what brings people into your boroughs, and I think people want to come to a safe environment, and I think people need to realise that when they do come into those areas, there is some rules and regulations as well. So if they're coming into a borough they don't live in, that they're not going to be noisy, they're not going to urinate, and there is going to be some sort of enforcement available, visible enforcement. I think that's really important. And it's worked very effectively right across London over the last few years, and we've used ASB tools and powers very effectively in relation to that. It's just the coordination and the role and responsibilities of all the partners involved, and where do they see themselves fitting into that process. And I think there's a danger sometimes, so going back to PSPOs and things like that, it's imposed in an area of a nighttime economy without the proper consultation, the business interests haven't been taken into account, and I think that's where it tends to go wrong, where the police haven't been given a role or a responsibility, they've just agreed it's a hotspot area for crime. And I think that's where the true partnership aspect of this is kind of slightly taken a back seat. And once you get businesses sitting around the table, then maybe enforcement action is not the right way of doing it. There's some really good examples of nighttime economy approaches in Manchester, which we've talked to Brick Lane, town centre manager, about that. And it's just getting it's not imposing another model from somewhere else on an area. It's about making it appropriate for you and making sure that you are getting the right service and approaches by all the agencies involved.
Just in terms of your point on legislation, I think, and I should say that there is an emphasis on nighttime economy, and indeed in our chambers, Philip Colvin is our head of chambers and is also the mayor's nighttime economy czar. I know you don't really like that word, but so it's right that there's dedicated work done around that. But in terms of legislation, the powers and tools already exist. And although we've spent a lot of time talking about social housing, many of these powers are tenure neutral. Yeah. So closure powers, for example, can be used to close a club and have been used to close clubs and other nighttime venues. And it's partly about understanding and getting that message out there that they're tenure neutral. And it's also about who takes ownership. Is it the police that takes ownership, or is it the local authority that take ownership? And they're the two main candidates, and there needs to be some clarity as to responsibility in those, as who leads and who takes responsibility. Some of the powers, like the PSPOs, are only available to local authorities, and so the obligation is on them to take the lead. Others are available to more than one body, and so there needs to be some thought given to who does what in each local authority area, but not in a way that means, well, we don't have to deal with that because that's not on our list, but more about taking ownership as opposed to avoiding that responsibility.
And there's other layers to that as well, I think, and this applies to all of the legislation. So when you asked about how effective the ASB tools are, one of the things that is at the forefront in my mind is actually the injunction is now available to the police. There are very, very few police forces that are using the injunction. The reason for that is not because they don't want to. They do not understand civil proceedings. They have been educated in all their careers around what criminal law and not using hearsay or professional opinion, and suddenly they're being told they can do those things. And there was no training or guidance or anything available in a practical level to tell a police officer how to put an injunction together and take it to court. And that's a big gap.
Happy? Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you, first of all, for attending today. Very thorough morning. We're going to return to the subject, as I said, in September. If you feel that you want to make further written contributions on behalf of your groups over the summer, please do. We'd very much welcome that. Finally, for me, just a couple of points. Can I just ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? Item 5, can I ask the committee to note our work programme? Item 6, our next meeting is scheduled for 20th of July. Can you kindly note that? I have no further urgent business, so I end the meeting. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Three in a serial, please.
GLA, Chamber, South.